Hello friends, I'm here to help you relax tonight. Tell me where you listening from and what time is it there? I'd love to know. Now get comfortable, let go of the day's worries and let this story guide you to a calm, peaceful sleep. You deserve to feel at ease, leaving all the stress behind. Subscribe now and join me for more stories to help you find peace. The night seemed darker than usual, the kind of darkness that wasn't just an absence of light but something heavier, something alive. The old, forgotten road stretched endlessly ahead, shrouded in shadows cast by gnarled trees. Mia tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the car engine and the faint crunch of gravel under her tires. The text she'd received earlier that evening still burned in her mind. It wasn't the words that unsettled her, it was the fact that the number didn't exist. She had tried calling back, only to be met with a mechanical voice stating the line was disconnected. And yet, the message had been clear: your mother left something behind. Come to the house tonight. Alone. Her mother. That single word carried more weight than she liked to admit. It had been 22 years since Mia last saw her, since she was abandoned without explanation. No letters, no calls, no closure. Just silence. And now, out of the blue, the text had stirred something she thought she'd buried long ago. Anger, confusion, but above all, fear. Why now? Why her? The car creaked as it climbed the hill, the estate finally coming into view. Her breath hitched. The house stood like a sentinel in the night, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the moonlit sky. Ivy crawled up its sides, choking the brick like a disease. The windows were dark, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her from within. As she pulled up to the gates, they groaned open on their own. The sound made her jump, the metallic screech cutting through the stillness like a warning. She hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn around, to leave. But something compelled her to stay. It wasn't just the mystery of her mother's past, it was the lure of answers she had sought her entire life. The driveway was long and overgrown, weeds snaking through the cracked pavement. Her car's headlights barely illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted in unnatural ways. She parked near the front steps and killed the engine, plunging herself into the suffocating silence of the night. As she stepped out, the cold hit her like a slap. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something faintly floral, roses perhaps. Her mother had always loved roses. The memory made her stomach churn. She hadn't thought about her mother in years, and now the past was clawing its way back to her in the most unsettling way. Mia approached the front door, the old key trembling in her hand. The envelope it came in had been plain, unmarked, except for the cryptic note: "Home isn't where the heart is, it's where the secrets are buried." She dismissed it as a cruel prank at first, but now, standing here, she wasn't so sure. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door creaked open, revealing a cavernous foyer swallowed by darkness. She fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. Her phone's flashlight would have to do. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing a grand staircase covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs hung from the chandelier above, and the once beautiful wallpaper peeled in long, jagged strips. But it wasn't just the decay that unsettled her, it was the feeling. The house felt wrong. It wasn't just empty, it felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting. She took a cautious step inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The sound echoed eerily as if the house were mocking her. The cold was worse in here, seeping into her bones. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake the chill, but it was no use. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, like the rustle of leaves on a still night. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper stopped. Her pulse raced as she scanned the room with her flashlight. Nothing. Just shadows playing tricks on her. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up her spine. But as she turned to head upstairs, her light caught something on the floor, a footprint. It was clear, distinct, and undeniably recent. The thick dust should have concealed any traces, yet there it was, leading toward the drawing room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she followed it, her mind racing with questions. Who else was here? And why hadn't they revealed themselves? The drawing room door creaked open, revealing a space frozen in time. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like silent sentinels, and the faint scent of roses was stronger here, almost overpowering. but it was the painting above the fireplace that drew her attention. Her mother's face stared back at her, young and vibrant, cradling a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Mia's stomach churned. She didn't remember this painting, and something about it felt off. Her mother's smile was too wide, her eyes too intense, as if they were hiding something. She stepped closer, noticing a small scratch on the frame. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it seemed deliberate. Her fingers trembled as she pried the frame loose, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. The word Evelyn was etched into the front, her mother's name. Mia's hands shook as she opened it, the first page revealing her mother's familiar handwriting. But before she could read more than a few words, the whispering returned. Louder this time and unmistakably angry. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. Her phone's flashlight flickered, the beam weak and unreliable. She swung it toward the painting and her heart stopped. Her mother's face had changed. The once smiling visage was now twisted in agony, her eyes bloodshot and staring directly at Mia. The baby in the blue blanket was gone. A chill ran down her spine as the whispers grew louder, surrounding her, suffocating her. She backed away, clutching the journal to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt alive, the shadows closing in around her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own racing heartbeat. She bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. Her flashlight revealed the staircase and she ran toward it, desperate to get out of the house. But as she reached the bottom step, something caught her eye. At the top of the stairs stood a figure. Tall, shadowy, and utterly still. Its presence was suffocating, radiating an aura of malevolence that made her knees weak. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was watching her. The journal slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. And in that moment, she realized something horrifying. The figure wasn't just watching her, it was waiting. All right, moving forward with Chapter 2. Let's dive deeper into the terror, expanding the mystery and tension while ensuring the hooks keep the viewer engaged. Here's Chapter 2. Mia's feet refused to move. She stood frozen at the base of the staircase, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The figure at the top of the stairs remained motionless, shrouded in darkness, yet it felt as though its unseen eyes bore straight into her soul. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her, paralyzed by fear. The house was silent again, yet the tension in the air was unbearable, like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Then the figure moved. Not in a natural way, but with a slow, deliberate glide, as though its feet never touched the ground. No, 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 Mia whispered, finally finding her voice, but the sound felt weak, insignificant in the face of what stood before her. She stumbled backward, her legs finally responding to the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand, casting erratic beams of light that only deepened the shadows. She didn't stop until she reached the front door. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at her chest as she twisted and pulled with all her strength, but the door seemed fused to the frame. The journal lay forgotten somewhere behind her, but all she could think about was escape. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that her breath puffed out in frantic clouds. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the staircase. Each step was measured, echoing through the empty house like a countdown. Mia spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she pointed it toward the stairs. The beam landed on nothing. The staircase was empty. She backed away, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft, almost childlike giggle, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. No, she whispered again, shaking her head. She wasn't going to wait for whatever it was to find her. If the front door wouldn't open, she'd try the back. She sprinted toward the kitchen, the sound of her footsteps drowned out by the blood rushing in her ears. The kitchen was worse than she remembered. The faint smell of decay hung in the air, and the once pristine counters were now coated in grime. Her flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm, the light returning weakly. She reached the back door and fumbled with the lock. This one turned, but as she pulled the door open, her relief turned to horror. The outside world was gone. The door opened to nothing but blackness, an all-consuming void that seemed to stretch endlessly. There was no ground, no sky, no escape, just a wall of impenetrable darkness. She slammed the door shut, her knees buckling beneath her as she slid to the floor. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her frozen skin. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The giggling returned, louder this time, closer. She scrambled to her feet, her back pressed against the door as her eyes darted around the room. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The giggling stopped. For a moment there was silence. And then a whisper, "You shouldn't have come." The voice was right behind her. Mia spun around, but there was nothing there. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. The house seemed to be closing in on her, the walls pressing closer, the air growing heavier. She needed to get out, now. She bolted for the hallway, her mind racing for another way out. The windows. There had to be windows. But as she passed the drawing room, something caught her eye. The journal was no longer on the floor. It was back in the hidden compartment, as though she had never touched it. A cold dread settled in her stomach, but she forced herself to keep moving. She reached the nearest window and threw back the heavy curtains, only to find the glass covered in frost. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and terrified, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. Mia blinked and the reflection smiled. She stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the carpet and landing hard on the floor. Her head hit the wooden boards, and for a moment the world spun. When she opened her eyes, the room was different. The frost on the window was gone, replaced by streaks of red, like bloody handprints smeared across the glass. The curtains were no longer heavy and velvet but thin and tattered, fluttering in a non-existent breeze. She pushed herself to her feet, her head throbbing. The house was changing, warping. She could feel it, like the walls themselves were alive, shifting and breathing around her. The air felt electric, charged with something she couldn't name. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching, but it grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like nails scraping against wood, desperate and relentless. And then a voice, a woman's voice, singing a lullaby. Mia's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was her mother's. She hadn't heard it in over 2 decades, but she would never forget it. "Mom?" she called out, her voice trembling. The singing stopped. The scratching continued. Against her better judgment, she found herself moving toward the stairs. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find another way out, but she couldn't ignore the pull of that voice. Her feet moved on their own, each step heavier than the last. The staircase seemed longer than before, stretching into darkness. The flashlight flickered again, the beam barely illuminating the path ahead. She reached the top, her breath hitching as the scratching grew louder. It was coming from the door at the end of the hall, the door to her mother's old bedroom. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel the cold seeping through the wood, could hear the faint whispers emanating from within. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn back to reveal a clear night sky. Everything was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood, except for the mirror. The mirror hung on the far wall, its surface cracked and tarnished. And in its fractured reflection, she saw something that wasn't there. A woman standing behind her, dressed in a tattered black gown, her face obscured by a veil. Mia spun around, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the woman was closer. The scratching stopped. And then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Mia's breath came in shallow gasps as she waved the flashlight wildly in front of her, its flickering beam struggling to push back the oppressive blackness. The mirror was gone, or at least she couldn't see it anymore. The silence was deafening, heavy like a weight pressing down on her chest. And then something moved. A faint rustle like fabric brushing against wood. It came from her left. She froze, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. No answer. Just the suffocating stillness of the room, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Her flashlight flickered again, its beam dimming further until it was barely more than a glow. She hid it against her palm, desperate for it to stay on. The rustling came again, closer this time, followed by a soft creak of the floorboards. "Please," Mia's voice cracked. She wasn't sure who or what she was pleading with, but it didn't matter. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, like dozens of unseen eyes were fixed on her, studying her every move. And then she saw it. In the faint glow of her failing flashlight, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was low to the ground, crawling toward her with a slow, deliberate motion. The figure was barely human, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its skin pale and mottled like something long dead. Its head jerked toward her, and she caught a glimpse of its face, if it could even be called that. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth stretched into a grotesque, eternal scream. Mia screamed too. She stumbled backward, her legs tangling beneath her as she crashed to the floor. The flashlight flew from her hand, spinning wildly across the room before coming to a stop, its beam now casting eerie shadows against the far wall. The creature crawled closer, its movements disjointed and erratic, like a marionette controlled by clumsy hands. No, no, no. Mia scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the cold wooden floor. Her back hit the wall, and she realized with a jolt that there was nowhere left to go. The thing was only feet away now, its mouth gaping open, revealing rows of jagged yellowed teeth. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The creature tilted its head as if listening for something. Mia held her breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. The silence stretched on, unbearable in its intensity. And then, without warning, the thing scuttled backward into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The flashlight flickered one last time and went out completely, plunging her into absolute darkness. She sat there, frozen, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't begin to answer. What was that thing? And why had it left? Her thoughts were interrupted by a new sound, soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper. It was faint at first, like wind passing through cracks in the walls, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and intertwining, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Mia forced herself to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. She felt along the wall for the door, desperate to escape this room, this nightmare. Her fingers brushed against the doorknob, cold and slick with condensation. She twisted it, but it wouldn't budge. No, she muttered, panic rising in her chest. She pulled harder, but the door remained stubbornly locked. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls around her. And then she felt it, a hand on her shoulder. She whipped around, swinging blindly in the darkness, but her fist connected with nothing. The whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that filled the room. It was neither male nor female, its tone low and echoing, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You were warned," it said. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. There was no response. Instead, the door behind her suddenly flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. Cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it the faint scent of roses. She didn't stop to question it. She bolted through the doorway, her bare feet pounding against the wooden floor as she sprinted down the hall. The house had changed again. The once familiar layout was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of twisting corridors and doors that led to nowhere. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing thicker with each passing second. Her chest burned as she ran, her lungs struggling to draw in oxygen. She turned a corner and skidded to a halt, nearly colliding with a tall, ornate mirror that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The surface was pristine, reflecting her terrified expression with unnerving clarity. But as she stared at her reflection, she noticed something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the dim light, was the shadowy figure she had seen earlier at the top of the stairs. Its veiled face loomed over her, its presence suffocating. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its hands now reaching for her. Mia turned and ran again, her mind consumed by blind panic. The whispers had returned, louder than before, their words sharp and accusatory. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." The phrase repeated over and over, overlapping until it was a deafening chorus. She stumbled into a room and slammed the door behind her, pressing her back against it as she struggled to catch her breath. The whispers were muffled now, but they didn't stop. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, revealing a small, cramped space filled with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. And then she saw it, a faint glow coming from one of the boxes. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside was an old lantern, its glass cracked but still functional. She lit it with trembling hands, the warm glow casting long shadows across the room. On the floor, partially buried under a pile of old newspapers, was the journal. She hadn't brought it here, yet somehow it had found her. Her hands shook as she picked it up, the leather cover cold against her skin. She flipped to the first page, her mother's handwriting leaping off the paper. "If you're reading this, it's already too late." Mia's hands trembled as she held the journal, her mother's warning scrawled across the brittle first page. The words seemed to pulse, their meaning sinking into her like ice. The lantern's glow flickered, casting jittery shadows across the cramped room. The whispers outside the door had faded, but their absence was almost worse, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She flipped to the next page, her mother's handwriting neat but hurried, as if written under duress. The first line made her stomach drop. "This house is not what it seems. It never was." Mia swallowed hard, her pulse racing as she scanned the page. The entries were fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Mentions of voices in the walls, doors that led to nowhere, and a figure that watched from the shadows. Her mother had known about the horrors of this place, had lived through them. The journal described things that defied explanation. Shadows moving when no one was there. Mirrors reflecting moments that hadn't yet happened. A suffocating darkness that seemed alive, creeping through the house like a sentient being. And then there was the figure. Her mother had called it the Watcher. Mia's blood ran cold as she read the description. The Watcher wasn't bound by the physical world. It existed in the cracks, the spaces between reality, waiting for its victims to make a mistake. It doesn't just haunt the house, her mother had written. It becomes the house. The lantern flickered again, the light dimming momentarily before surging back to life. A chill ran down Mia's spine as she turned the page, her breath catching in her throat at what she saw. A sketch of the Watcher, crude but unmistakable. Its veiled face, its impossibly long limbs, it was the thing she had seen in the mirror. Her mother's words beneath the sketch were almost unreadable, scrawled in frantic strokes. "Do not let it touch you. Do not listen to its voice. And whatever you do, do not trust the house." Mia's grip tightened on the journal as a loud thud echoed from somewhere above her. She froze, the sound reverberating through the walls like a heartbeat. It came again, closer this time. Her lantern flickered once more, the light dimming to a faint glow. She had to move. Staying in one place felt like an invitation for whatever was out there. She shoved the journal into her bag and gripped the lantern tightly as she opened the door. The hallway beyond was silent, but the air felt heavier, thicker. It clung to her skin like a damp shroud. The house had shifted again. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the walls lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Each door was identical, painted a dull, lifeless gray with no handles or locks. As Mia stepped into the corridor, she noticed that the doors seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing. The thudding sound returned, louder now, echoing from somewhere down the hall. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, but heavier, more deliberate. She couldn't tell if it was moving toward her or away. She forced herself to move, her bare feet silent against the cold wooden floor. The lantern's light barely illuminated the path ahead, the shadows pressing in on her from all sides. She kept her eyes on the end of the corridor, which seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. She whipped her head around, the lantern's glow sweeping across the hallway. One of the doors had opened, just a crack. The faintest sliver of light spilled out, casting an eerie glow onto the floor. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the door. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what lay beyond. But something about it compelled her, an invisible force pulling her closer. Her hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the door, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. The room beyond was small and unassuming, almost normal. A single wooden chair sat in the center, its back facing her. On the floor next to it was a small music box, its lid open, playing a hauntingly familiar melody. Mia stepped inside, the lantern casting a warm glow over the room. She knelt beside the music box, her fingers brushing against its delicate carvings. It was hers. She hadn't seen it in years, but she recognized the intricate floral design. It had been a gift from her mother when she was a child. As the melody played, memories flooded her mind, warm, happy moments she had long buried. But the warmth quickly gave way to unease as the tune began to distort, the notes stretching and bending into something unnatural. The door slammed shut behind her, and the music stopped abruptly. Mia spun around, her heart in her throat. The chair in the center of the room was no longer empty. A figure sat there, its back to her, shrouded in shadow. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure began to move, its head tilting slowly to the side, as though listening for something. And then it stood. Mia stumbled backward, her lantern shaking in her hand. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and unnaturally thin. It turned to face her, and she realized with horror that it had no face. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Do not let it touch you." The figure took a step toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Mia's instincts kicked in, and she bolted for the door, yanking at the handle with all her strength. It wouldn't budge. The figure was closer now, its faceless head tilting as it reached out a spindly hand. Desperation took over, and Mia swung the lantern at it, the glass shattering on impact. Flames erupted, casting the room in an orange glow. The creature recoiled, its body twisting and writhing in the firelight. Mia didn't wait to see what would happen next. She threw herself against the door, and this time it gave way. She stumbled into the hallway, the sound of the creature's screams echoing behind her. The corridor was different again, the walls now lined with mirrors. Each reflection showed her running, but there was something else, something chasing her. The mirrors reflected her desperation, her wild eyes darting in every direction as she sprinted down the corridor. But what made her blood run cold wasn't her own image, it was the shadows in the reflections. They moved unnaturally, darting across the glass as though they were alive. And worse, they weren't just following her, they were ahead of her, waiting. Mia skidded to a halt, gasping for breath. She turned to look back the way she'd come, but the corridor behind her had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. The shadows in. The mirrors seemed to ripple, growing more pronounced, their outlines sharpening into something almost humanoid. Her chest tightened as the air around her grew colder, the chill seeping into her bones. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, this time in her own voice. "You shouldn't have come back. You were warned." Mia's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to move. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor as she ran, the mirrors on either side blurring into streaks of silver. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to look into the glass. Whatever was in those mirrors, it wasn't her anymore. The corridor stretched endlessly, the walls closing in tighter with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't go any further, she saw it, a door at the end of the hallway. Relief surged through her, and she pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in protest. The door was old and weathered, its wood splintered and warped. It didn't fit the house's modern design, standing out like a relic from another time. Mia reached for the handle, but the door swung open on its own. She hesitated for a moment, peering into the room beyond. It was bathed in a dim, amber glow, the source of the light obscured by thick shadows. The room was empty, save for a single object in the center, a rocking chair. Her heart sank as she stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach twist. The chair creaked softly, rocking back and forth despite the still air. She took a cautious step closer, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The chair stopped abruptly, as if sensing her approach. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that made her ears ring. Mia's breath hitched as she noticed something resting on the seat of the chair, a photograph. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The image was faded, the edges curling with age. It showed a young girl no older than 6 or 7, standing in front of the very house she was in now. The girl was smiling, her hair tied back with a red ribbon. It was Mia. Her stomach turned as she stared at the photograph. She didn't remember this picture. She didn't even remember being here as a child. But the more she looked at it, the more certain she was, it was her. A faint sound broke the silence, like a distant hum. It grew louder, resolving into the haunting melody of the music box she'd seen earlier. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. Mia turned the photograph over, her heart pounding as she read the words scrawled on the back in her mother's handwriting. She never left. The music stopped abruptly, and the room was plunged into silence once more. Mia's grip tightened on the photograph as the shadows in the room began to shift, creeping toward her like a living thing. She backed away, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The shadows seemed to thicken, coalescing into a figure that towered over her. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its darkness consuming the dim light of the room. Mia's mind raced, her mother's warnings flashing through her head. Do not let it touch you. Do not trust the house. But the shadows were closing in, leaving her with nowhere to run. Why are you doing this? She demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended a hand, long and skeletal, its fingers impossibly thin. Mia's pulse quickened as the shadows behind her began to ripple, forming smaller shapes that moved in jerky, unnatural motions. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the door was gone. The walls seemed to pulse, the wood groaning as if the house itself was alive. And then the shadows spoke. Their voices overlapped, a cacophony of whispers that clawed at her sanity. She couldn't understand the words, but their tone was unmistakable, accusatory, condemning. They grew louder, more insistent, until her head felt like it would split open. Stop, she screamed, clutching her head. I don't understand what you want. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single chilling voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It's not what we want. It's what you owe. Mia froze, her blood turning to ice. What I owe, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadows surged forward, forcing her to stumble back. Her foot hit something solid, and she turned to see the rocking chair directly behind her, its seat now empty. The photograph slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. Her mother's journal fell from her bag, its pages fanning out like a desperate plea. Mia dropped to her knees, snatching it up and flipping through the entries. One line caught her eye, scrawled hastily in the margins. The watcher feeds on regret. It knows your secrets, your guilt. It will use them against you. Mia's heart pounded as she realized what the voice had meant. It wasn't just about the house or the shadows. It was about her. The watcher wasn't hunting her randomly. It had been waiting, feeding off something inside her, something she had buried deep and refused to face. The figure loomed closer, its veiled face inches from hers. For the first time, Mia saw her own reflection in the dark fabric, her face distorted and twisted with fear. And then the voice spoke again, its tone cold and final. You can't run from what you are. Mia's chest heaved, her lungs struggling to pull in air as the voice's ominous words echoed in her mind. You can't run from what you are. The shadows around her pulsed with life, pressing closer, feeding off her fear. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. The watcher loomed before her, silent but unyielding, its presence suffocating. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were alive, twisting and contorting as if mocking her desperation. And then, without warning, the shadows retreated, sucked back into the walls like smoke pulled into a vacuum. The room fell eerily silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough for her to breathe. The watcher was gone. But the relief was short-lived. The photograph she had dropped began to smolder, the edges curling as if consumed by invisible flames. Mia stepped back, watching in horror as the image of her younger self distorted, her face twisting into something unrecognizable before the photo disintegrated completely. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering violently despite the absence of any wind. Mia hesitated, then crouched down to grab it. Her fingers brushed the aged paper, and an intense shock coursed through her, jolting her backward. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't in the room anymore. She was outside. The cold night air bit at her skin, and the ground beneath her was soft and damp. She looked around, her heart racing as she realized where she was, the backyard of the house. But it was different. The overgrown grass and tangled weeds were gone, replaced by a perfectly manicured lawn. The old, rusted swing set she remembered from her childhood stood in pristine condition, its chains gleaming under the pale moonlight. A chill ran down her spine as she saw someone sitting on the swing. It was a little girl. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The girl was facing away from her, her small hands clutching the chains of the swing. Her hair was tied back with a red ribbon, the same red ribbon Mia had worn in the photograph. The girl began to hum softly, the haunting melody of the music box filling the air. Mia took a cautious step forward, her bare feet sinking into the dewy grass. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The girl stopped humming. Slowly, she turned her head to look at Mia, and the sight made her blood run cold. The girl's face was hers, but not as she remembered it. The features were wrong, distorted, her eyes hollow and lifeless. The smile that stretched across her face was too wide, too sharp. "You left me," the girl said, her voice high-pitched and accusatory. "You promised you wouldn't, but you did." Mia's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled backward. "I don't understand," she stammered. "Who are you?" The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You know who I am. I'm the part of you that you tried to forget. The part you buried." Mia shook her head, her mind racing. "This doesn't make any sense. I don't remember." "Because you didn't want to," the girl interrupted, her tone sharp. She stood up from the swing, her movements unnatural, jerky. "But it doesn't matter. I remember. And so does it." Mia froze. "It." The girl's hollow eyes gleamed as she pointed toward the house. "The Watcher. It found you because of me. Because of what you did. What I did." Mia's voice cracked, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I don't know what you're talking about." The girl stepped closer, her smile fading. "You will?" Before Mia could respond, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The house loomed behind the girl, its windows glowing with an eerie red light. The walls seemed to shift and breathe, the entire structure pulsating like a living organism. The girl's voice softened, almost sad. "You can't run from the truth, Mia. It's part of you. And now it's part of this house." The ground split beneath Mia's feet and she fell, tumbling into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was back inside the house, but it wasn't the same. The walls were lined with veins that pulsed with a sickly green light, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The floor beneath her was soft and damp, like flesh. Mia scrambled to her feet, her breathing ragged. The journal was still in her hand, its pages blank except for one word scrawled across the center in bold, jagged letters. "Remember." The whispers returned, louder now, filling her head with fragmented memories. Her mother's voice, her own screams, the sound of something breaking. Images flashed before her eyes. A small, dark room, the music box, and a door that should have stayed locked. The Watcher's voice cut through the chaos, low and menacing. "You can't hide from it, Mia. The house won't let you." The walls began to close in, the veins pulsating faster as the house seemed to come alive around her. Mia clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. She had to remember. Whatever it was, whatever she had buried, it was the key to escaping this nightmare. But as the walls pressed closer, the Watcher's form began to emerge from the shadows, its skeletal hand reaching for her. Mia's heart pounded as she realized the horrifying truth. The only way out was to face what she had been running from. The walls were alive, pulsating with a grotesque rhythm that matched the pounding of Mia's heart. The air grew thicker, choking her with every breath as the Watcher's hand extended toward her, its skeletal fingers curling as if to beckon her closer. Mia's body screamed for her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, the journal clutched tightly against her chest. The word "remember" burned in her mind, a single, unyielding command. The Watcher's voice slithered through the air, low and venomous. "You've locked it away for too long. The house knows." "I know. And now, so will you." The shadows swirled around her, forming a vortex of darkness that seemed to pull at her very soul. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head as memories began to surface, fragmented and fleeting, like shards of a broken mirror. A locked door, a child's scream, and her own voice, trembling and desperate, pleading with someone she couldn't see. "No," she shouted, the sound of her own voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "I don't want to remember." The shadows paused as if amused by her defiance. The Watcher's hollow face tilted, its skeletal hand lowering slightly. "You don't have a choice. The house feeds on what you've hidden. Your guilt, your regret. And you've given it more than enough to grow strong." The walls around her began to shift, the grotesque veins twisting into shapes that resembled faces, contorted and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. Mia stumbled backward, her legs shaking as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Each face was familiar. Her neighbor, Mrs. Klein, who had vanished without a trace 2 years ago. The handyman who had worked on the house when she was a teenager. And a young girl, no older than 10, her wide, terrified eyes staring directly at Mia. The girl's face sent a jolt through her, and suddenly Mia was no longer in the grotesque room. She was back in the past. The air was warm and filled with the sound of cicadas. She stood in the backyard of the house, a child again, her small hands clutching a stuffed bear. Her mother's voice drifted from the porch, calling her name. Mia, come inside now. But she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the small locked door at the base of the house, the door her mother had always told her to stay away from. The memory played out like a movie, and Mia could only watch, unable to intervene. She saw her younger self drop the stuffed bear and take cautious steps toward the forbidden door. Her small hand reached out, fingers brushing against the rusted lock. And then the scene shifted violently. She was inside the house again, but it wasn't her house. It was older, darker, filled with the suffocating scent of damp wood and decay. Her younger self stood in the center of the room, staring at something on the floor. It was a box. The same music box she had found in the attic earlier. The melody began to play, soft and haunting, filling the room with an eerie calm. Young Mia's face lit up with a mixture of curiosity and fear as she reached out to touch it. "No," adult Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't touch it." But the child couldn't hear her. The moment young Mia's fingers brushed the music box, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows came alive, swirling around the child like a storm. She screamed, her small voice echoing in the confined space as the box's melody grew louder, more distorted. The memory faded, and Mia was back in the present, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the watcher's voice filled the room. "Do you understand now? You let it in. You gave it life. And now it wants more." Mia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was just a child. I didn't know." "But you do now," the watcher interrupted, its skeletal form looming closer. "And you've done nothing to stop it. Every time you came back to this house, every time you ignored the signs, you fed it. You let it grow stronger." The shadows pressed in around her, suffocating her with their weight. The faces in the walls twisted and writhed, their silent screams growing louder in her mind. Mia clutched the journal, her hands trembling as she flipped through the blank pages. There had to be something, some way to stop this. Her mother had known, she was sure of it. And then she saw it. One final entry hidden at the very back of the journal, written in frantic, uneven handwriting. "The music box is the key. Destroy it and you destroy the watcher. But beware, the house won't let you." Mia's heart raced as the realization hit her. The music box wasn't just a relic of her childhood, it was the source of everything. The shadows, the voices, the watcher itself, they all stemmed from the cursed object. The watcher seemed to sense her resolve. Its form shifted, becoming more solid, more menacing. The shadows around it pulsed with anger, the room trembling as if the house itself was trying to stop her. Mia forced herself to her feet, clutching the journal like a lifeline. She didn't know how she was going to find the music box, let alone destroy it, but she had to try. As she took a step forward, the watcher's voice cut through the air, cold and final. "You can't win, Mia. The house won't let you leave. And even if you do, you'll never escape what you've done." Mia ignored it, her jaw set with determination. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of defiance against the darkness that had consumed her life. But deep down, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The house groaned in protest as Mia moved through the darkened hallway. The air felt heavy, as if the very walls were trying to crush her under the weight of their secrets. She could hear the faint sound of the music box in the distance, its eerie lullaby rising and falling, like the pulse of the house itself. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the sound, her feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. She knew she had to find it. The music box was the key, the only way to stop the watcher, to free herself from the nightmare she had unwittingly unleashed. As she moved further into the house, the temperature dropped, and her breath came out in visible puffs. The once familiar rooms now felt like a maze, each one more twisted and distorted than the last. It was as if the house was alive, shifting and changing to keep her from reaching her goal. Mia's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. She had no idea how she was going to destroy the music box or if it would even work. All she knew was that she had to try. She reached the door at the end of the hallway, the same one she had seen in her memories, the one she had never been allowed to open as a child. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her pulse quickening. The whispers from the walls were growing louder, urging her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But Mia didn't listen. With a deep breath, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and strange trinkets, but it was the center of the room that drew her attention. There, on a pedestal bathed in soft light, stood the music box. Mia's stomach twisted as she stepped into the room. The air felt thick, charged with an almost palpable sense of dread. The box sat untouched, as if waiting for her to make the final move. It looked so innocent, so harmless. Just a small antique box with delicate carvings etched into its surface. But Mia knew better now. She knew what it was capable of. With trembling hands, she approached the pedestal, each step feeling like an eternity. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the box. The moment her skin made contact, the music began to play. It was the same tune, the same haunting melody that had filled her nightmares. The shadows in the room flickered, like a storm about to break. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped even further, sending a chill straight to her bones. Mia hesitated, but only for a moment. She could feel the watcher's presence just beyond the door, watching, waiting. It was now or never. Taking a deep breath, Mia lifted the lid of the music box. The sound that filled the room was deafening, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The music was no longer sweet. It was twisted, distorted, filled with a maddening urgency. The shadows on the walls writhed, taking on forms that were far too real, too human. Faces began to appear, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Mia stumbled back, her heart racing as the room seemed to come alive with the force of the box's power. The watcher's voice echoed in her mind, more insistent than ever. "You can't stop it, Mia. You can't outrun what you've done." Mia clenched her teeth, refusing to give in. She wasn't going to let the watcher win. Not again. She grabbed the box with both hands, feeling its unnatural weight, and slammed the lid shut. The room fell silent. The shadows retreated. The whispers stopped. But it wasn't over. As Mia stood there, gasping for breath, the floor beneath her began to tremble. The walls seemed to shift, the house groaning as if in pain. The music box had stopped, but something far worse had begun. She could hear it now, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and they were coming for her. Mia turned, her eyes wide with terror. There, at the entrance of the room, stood the watcher. It was no longer just a shadow. It had taken form, its skeletal face twisted into something grotesque. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its body was cloaked in a swirling mass of darkness. The air around it crackled with energy, like a storm ready to break. The watcher stepped forward, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward her. "You think you can destroy me?" the voice hissed, its tone dripping with disdain. "You've only made me stronger." Mia's breath hitched as the watcher moved closer. She could feel the weight of its presence, the suffocating pressure of its gaze. Her hands shook as she backed away, the journal still clutched tightly in her grasp. There had to be a way. There had to be something she could do. And then she remembered. The journal. The pages. She flipped it open, her hands fumbling as she searched for anything that could help. The final entry was still there, the one that spoke of the music box. And underneath it, in smaller, almost illegible writing, was another message. "Destroy the box and you destroy me. But to truly break the curse, you must destroy the house. The watcher is bound to it." Mia's heart skipped a beat. The house itself. The watcher wasn't just a force. It was part of the house, a manifestation of everything the house had become over the years. She looked back at the watcher, its form growing more solid with every passing second. She had no choice. She couldn't escape it. She had to destroy it. With all the strength she had left, Mia ran toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she froze. The house itself was fighting back. The door wouldn't budge. The walls closed in, the shadows growing thicker, darker. The watcher was closing in on her, its hand reaching for her, its fingers just inches from her neck. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The only way out was to destroy it all. The air was thick with dread as Mia stood before the door, her hand frozen on the handle. The watcher's presence loomed behind her, so close now she could feel the cold, deathly chill of its breath against her skin. She couldn't move, couldn't think. All her efforts had led her here, to this moment, trapped in the heart of the very nightmare she had created. The walls of the house groaned, as though the structure itself was alive, feeding on her fear. The watcher's skeletal fingers hovered above her, poised to grab her at any moment, But Mia couldn't tear her eyes away from the realization that was slowly dawning on her. She had been running from the wrong thing. The Watcher, this thing of darkness, terror, and twisted power, was only a part of it. A manifestation of something far older, far more insidious. And it wasn't just her fault. It was the house itself. She turned her gaze back to the journal in her hands, the answer written there, hidden in the shadows of the words. The house was bound to the Watcher, and the Watcher to the house. Destroying one without the other was impossible. It had to end now. The house needed to be destroyed, and only then could she rid herself of the curse that had plagued her family for generations. Her fingers gripped the journal tightly, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her. Mia's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, any tool, any spark of hope. But all she could see were the suffocating shadows, creeping closer with every passing second. "You can't escape," the Watcher whispered, its voice like the hiss of a serpent. Its form loomed larger with every heartbeat, the grotesque figure of bone and darkness pressing closer. "This place will consume you just as it consumed your ancestors." But Mia didn't listen. She couldn't. The house had stolen everything from her, her childhood, her peace of mind, her sanity, and it had to end. She tore her gaze away from the Watcher for just a second and glanced around, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the shadows crawling along the walls like living things. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, near the base of the wall, a small crack. Not large, but enough to be seen if you were desperate enough. Mia stumbled toward it, the weight of the journal pulling her chest down, but her heart was beating faster now, and her mind was clearer. With a strength she didn't know she had, Mia dropped to her knees and pushed her hand into the crack. Her fingers scraped against the rough surface of the floor, but she found something cold, something solid. A piece of metal. She yanked it free, her fingers closing around it as she lifted it into the dim light. A crowbar. The Watcher's laugh echoed through the room, hollow and cruel. "You think that will help?" But Mia didn't care. She had to do this. There was no turning back now. With the crowbar in her grip, she turned toward the far wall, the one that had been whispering to her for days, urging her to remember. She could feel the vibrations in the air as the walls seemed to close in tighter, as if the house itself was trying to push her out. "Mia," the Watcher said, its voice now a twisted hiss. "You can't fight fate. The house will always have you. There is no escape." Ignoring the Watcher's taunts, Mia struck the wall. The crowbar hit with a deafening crash, sending a shockwave of noise through the room. Dust and debris filled the air, the walls trembled under the force of her strike. The Watcher howled, its form flickering as if it were losing its grip on reality. Mia struck again, harder this time. The crowbar sank deeper into the wall, splintering the ancient wood with a violent crack. But then something changed. The house seemed to pulse, the entire room shuddering as if it had a heartbeat. The walls began to crack, but not in the way Mia had hoped. Instead of crumbling, they seemed to fight back, thickening, solidifying. The shadows darkened, growing in size until they loomed over her, choking out the last vestiges of light. Mia's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. The house wasn't just resisting her, it was fighting back. "You don't belong here, Mia," the Watcher snarled, its form flickering in and out of existence. "You've always known that." Mia didn't let the fear take root. She couldn't afford to. With the crowbar in both hands, she delivered another blow. And then another. The walls were cracking, but there was something beneath them. Something alive. The air seemed to freeze, the vibrations growing more intense, as if the entire house was holding its breath. And then it happened. The floor beneath her feet cracked open, a deep, cavernous hole appearing as the floorboards splintered. Mia staggered back, heart racing, as the Watcher's laughter filled the room once more. It wasn't mocking now, it was filled with a twisted sense of satisfaction. The hole grew wider, the darkness below swallowing everything in its path. Mia could hear something moving in the depths of the house. A horrible, scraping sound like nails on a chalkboard, followed by a low, rumbling growl. "You're too late," the Watcher crooned. "The house is awake. And it's hungry." Mia's breath quickened. She felt a cold sweat forming on her skin as the darkness in the hole seemed to pull at her, drawing her in. There was no way out now, no easy solution. The house had woken, and it was no longer something she could fight with a crowbar. With a final, desperate cry, Mia threw herself toward the hole. She didn't know what would happen, didn't know if she could make it out alive. But she had no other choice. The darkness was already claiming her, and this was the only way to destroy it, before it consumed everything. And just as the darkness swallowed her, Mia screamed. Mia awoke in darkness. No, it wasn't just darkness. It was the absence of everything, a suffocating void that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on her from all sides. She gasped for air, her hands instinctively reaching out in front of her, but her fingers met nothing but cold, empty air. She had no idea where she was, only that it felt wrong. Every instinct screamed that she needed to move, to escape, but there was no escape from this. Not anymore. For a long moment, Mia remained still, trying to steady her racing heart. Her mind was clouded, her memories blurred. She remembered falling into the darkness, the hole in the floor, and then nothing. A void. Slowly, her surroundings began to take shape. It wasn't the room she had been in before, nor was it the familiar halls of the house. This place felt ancient. The ground beneath her feet was cold stone, slick with dampness. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, as though it had been untouched by human life for centuries. There were no walls, no ceiling, just a never-ending expanse of blackness stretching in all directions. And then she saw them. At first, they were distant, scattered throughout the darkness, glowing faintly like embers in a dying fire. But as Mia's eyes adjusted, the eyes grew larger, nearer, more intense. They were everywhere, blinking, watching her, unblinking, cold. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The eyes were too many, too endless. She was surrounded by them. The fear surged in her chest again. Was she dead? Was this some sort of purgatory, a place where she would be trapped for all eternity, tormented by the Watcher's gaze? The last thing she remembered was that horrible, hollow laugh echoing in her mind as the house had claimed her. Had the Watcher won? Had it dragged her into this place, where nothing existed but its endless eyes? But then, amid the hundreds of glowing eyes, one set stood out. It was different. It was familiar. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them. The eyes were hers. They were her own, staring back at her from the infinite darkness. What is this place? Mia whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, the words lost in the heavy silence. The eyes blinked, and then the space around her began to shift. She wasn't just standing anymore. She was moving, pulled forward by some unseen force. Her feet seemed to leave the ground, and for a moment she felt weightless, floating in the emptiness. But then the pull grew stronger. She was dragged forward, her body helpless, unable to resist the force pulling her through the dark void. Her hands flailed at the air, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes on her now, closing in, the darkness pressing in on all sides. She wasn't alone. The ground returned beneath her feet, hard and unyielding, and she stumbled forward, finally able to move on her own. But the emptiness around her was growing. It wasn't just a void anymore, it was something more. It was alive. A cold wind picked up, swirling through the darkness, carrying with it the scent of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. The wind whispered something to her, low and insistent, too faint to make out. You can't escape. Mia's heart pounded as the words echoed through her mind, as if the darkness itself were speaking to her. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself to walk, to move forward. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way back. It's too late. The voice came again, louder now, more forceful. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The Watcher's voice. You've already failed, Mia. The voice seemed to come from all around her, filling the empty void with its cruel, mocking tone. She could feel it pressing in on her, like a physical presence, surrounding her from all directions. Mia shook her head, desperate to ignore the voice. She couldn't give in. Not now. You think you can fight me? The Watcher's voice sneered. You've already seen what happens when you try. You are mine now. The darkness closed in tighter, the eyes all around her intensifying, their gazes fixed on her with malevolent intent. Mia's hands clenched into fists as she stepped forward, refusing to let the fear overtake her. She had come this far. She wasn't going to let the Watcher win now. But then something changed. The floor beneath her began to crack, the sound of breaking stone filling the air. The void trembled, the shadows shifting as if something was stirring beneath the surface. Mia stumbled back, her eyes wide with panic. She had felt it before, the presence of the house, the watcher. And now it was waking up. The eyes in the darkness seemed to multiply, growing in number until they were no longer individual, but a mass of glowing lights that swirled around her. Mia backed away, her breath quickening. No, not again. But it was too late. The walls of darkness began to close in on her, pushing her toward the center of the void. She tried to move, to run, but the space itself seemed to shrink around her, the darkness growing thicker. The watcher's voice filled her mind once more, its words slow and deliberate. There is nowhere to hide. Mia's heart raced. She had to fight. She had to find a way out. And then, like a spark in the dark, something caught her eye. A shadow, a figure moving through the mass of eyes. It was small, but it was there. Mia's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could it really be? She pushed forward, ignoring the crushing weight of the darkness around her, following the shadow, trusting her instincts. As she moved closer, the figure grew clearer. It was a person. Help! Mia cried out, her voice trembling in desperation. Please help me. The figure stopped, turning to face her. It was a woman, her features pale and distorted, like a ghost of someone Mia had once known. The woman's eyes were the same dark void Mia had seen all around her, empty and hollow. You're too late, the woman whispered, her voice cold and distant. It has already begun. And with that, the woman faded into the darkness, leaving Mia alone once more in the suffocating void. Mia stumbled backward, her legs unsteady as the woman's words echoed in her mind. It has already begun. The phrase clung to her like a shadow, making the air feel even heavier, suffocating her with dread. The eyes around her still glowed, but now they felt colder, more menacing. It was as if they had been waiting, watching, ever since she had stepped into the void. The darkness seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, a rhythmic, unnatural sound that reverberated in her skull. She wanted to scream, to lash out at the unseen force that held her captive, but her throat was dry, her voice lost in the suffocating silence that surrounded her. You can't fight it, the watcher's voice whispered again, curling around her mind like smoke. It's too late. It's already inside you. Mia's body tensed at the words. Was this it? Was this the moment when everything she had fought for would collapse? The house, the watcher, the twisted nightmare, it was all coming together now, closing in on her. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. She clenched her fists, fighting against the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had made it this far. She wasn't going to let the darkness consume her. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet trembled, as though the void itself was coming alive. The shadows began to swirl, the eyes blinking faster now, their gleams sharpening. Mia's heart pounded, her instincts screaming at her to run, to escape this nightmare before it swallowed her whole. But she couldn't move. The darkness was everywhere, pushing her, pulling her, suffocating her with its presence. Her legs were frozen in place, her body unwilling to respond. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the darkness, the sound so deep and primal that it felt like it was coming from the very core of the void. The ground shook beneath her, and Mia was forced to her knees as a wave of pressure slammed into her chest. It was like the house, or whatever this place was rejecting her, pushing her back into the abyss from which she had come. You are nothing, the watcher's voice said, its tone colder than ever. You will never escape. The house will always find you. You are its creation. Mia's eyes widened as the words sank in. Was that it? Was she truly a part of this twisted house, this force of darkness? Was her existence nothing more than a byproduct of its curse? The question burned in her mind, the thought of it clawing at her sanity. No, she wouldn't believe it. No, she shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. She wasn't going to let the watcher win. She wasn't going to let this nightmare define her. And then, without warning, the darkness receded. The ground beneath her feet settled, the oppressive pressure lifting, leaving her gasping for air. The eyes, those cold, soulless eyes, blinked out one by one until there was only silence. Mia blinked, her mind struggling to catch up with the sudden shift. Was it over? Had she done something to stop it? But as the darkness faded, another figure appeared. This time it wasn't the ghostly woman, but a man. His face was obscured by shadows, his features indistinguishable. He stood tall, his presence commanding, and for the briefest moment, Mia thought she recognized him. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling as she took a step back. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. There was something about him, something familiar yet terrifying, that sent a chill down Mia's spine. He stepped forward, and the shadows seemed to cling to him, twisting around his form like a cloak. As he came closer, Mia could see his face more clearly. His eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness, just like the eyes she had seen all around her. But there was something else there too, something that made Mia's blood run cold. His eyes were not just empty. They were filled with something else, something that had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface. "You already know who I am," the man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, like it had been worn down by centuries of use. Mia shook her head, her mind struggling to process the words. Who was he? "I am you," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "I am what you've become, what you always were. The Watcher, the house, everything, it's all inside you, Mia. You are part of it." Mia's world tilted. The ground seemed to shift beneath her as his words sunk in. Was this some twisted version of her? Was this the culmination of all her fears, all her struggles? "No," Mia whispered, shaking her head furiously. "No, that's not true." But the man only smiled, the darkness swirling around him growing thicker. "It is true. You've been running from yourself this whole time." Mia backed away, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. "You've always known, haven't you?" he continued, his voice seeping into her mind like poison. "The house, the Watcher, the fear, it's all a part of you. You are the one who created it. You are the one who allowed it to grow." The shadows seemed to pulse as though reacting to his words. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind spiraling out of control. Was he right? Was she responsible for all of this? The man took another step toward her, his smile widening. "It's too late to run, Mia. There is no escape. You've already become a part of it." Mia fell to her knees, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She was trapped in her own creation, bound to the house and the Watcher forever. There was no way out. But even as the darkness closed in, Mia's resolve hardened. "I won't let you win," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. But deep down she knew the battle was far from over. Mia's chest rose and fell with each labored breath. The dark figure, this shadowy version of herself, loomed before her, his words a cold weight pressing down on her soul. His smile never faltered, his eyes dark and unforgiving. Every inch of her body screamed for escape, but the moment she tried to move, she felt an invisible force holding her in place. "You've come so far," the figure said, his voice oozing with cruel amusement. "But it doesn't matter, Mia. You're already ours." Her mind was reeling, the words spinning in her head like an endless loop. "You are part of it." No, this couldn't be happening. She couldn't be trapped in this nightmare forever. She had to break free. She had come too far to fall into the same dark hole again. But as she struggled to stand, her body betraying her, she saw something that made her freeze. The void around her, the empty expanse, was shifting. The ground trembled beneath her, the stone floor cracking and splitting, as though something was rising from within the earth itself. Dark tendrils of shadow slithered out from the cracks, curling and twisting like serpents. The shadows seemed to feed off her fear, growing in size and strength as they spread across the floor. "No!" Mia screamed, scrambling backward. The shadows were alive, more alive than ever before. They were reaching for her, closing in with every passing second. The dark figure, the twisted version of herself, only watched, his gaze cold and calculating. Mia's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help her. There was no escape, no way out. She was trapped in this nightmarish labyrinth of her own making. The house, the Watcher, the shadows, it was all a part of her now. But there had to be something she could do. She couldn't just give up. "You're already lost," the figure sneered. "It's too late." But Mia refused to listen. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had faced horrors before, nightmares that made her feel like she was losing herself, but she had always found a way to survive. This time would be no different. With a surge of defiance, Mia pushed herself to her feet. The shadows recoiled as she stood, as though her determination was a force they couldn't quite touch. She could feel their pull, the coldness of their reach, but she resisted. She took a step forward, then another, her legs shaking but strong. "You can't escape," the figure repeated, its voice now laced with venom. "You can't run from what you are." Mia didn't stop. She reached down into the depths of herself, searching for the strength that had always been there, buried beneath the fear and confusion. The same strength that had kept her going through every terror, every horror. The same strength that had brought her here to this point. As her resolve solidified, she felt the darkness begin to falter. The tendrils of shadow shrank back, retreating just slightly. The pressure on her chest eased. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She moved faster now, the shadows still clawing at her, but weaker. They seemed to writhe and hiss as though they were losing their grip on her. Stop. The command came from the figure, its voice deepening into something monstrous and filled with fury. But Mia ignored it. She had no time for its threats, no time for its lies. She kept moving, her every step determined, every breath a battle. She was getting closer. She could feel it, the edge of something, a crack in the dark wall that had trapped her. And then she saw it. A light. It wasn't much, just a faint glimmer in the distance, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope in her chest. Mia ran toward the light, pushing through the darkness, the shadows clawing at her heels, the figure's voice shouting at her to stop, to give in. But she wouldn't. As she drew closer to the light, the darkness began to pull back. The shadows shrank away, their grip loosening, their power fading. The figure's voice grew quieter, more distant, as though it was being swallowed by the very darkness it had once commanded. She was almost there. And then, in an instant, the shadows vanished. The cold, suffocating darkness was gone, replaced by a soft, warm light that filled the space around her. The ground beneath her feet was solid again, the air clean and breathable. Mia stopped, her heart racing in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. She had made it. But as she stood there, bathed in the soft glow of light, she realized something. The house was still with her. Even though the darkness had lifted, the sense of dread remained, lurking in the corners of her mind. She couldn't escape the truth. The watcher, the darkness, the fear, it was a part of her. But Mia wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't afford to. There was still work to be done. She would find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. But for now, as the last remnants of darkness faded away, she stood tall, her resolve stronger than ever. The light around Mia flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. She blinked, her eyes still adjusting to the sudden brightness. For a brief moment, she thought she had escaped, thought the nightmare was over. But as the shadows shifted, she realized that it wasn't quite finished yet. The warmth of the light felt almost unreal, too perfect in comparison to the cold, suffocating darkness she had just escaped. It was like stepping out of a storm into an uncertain calm. It didn't make her feel safe, it made her feel exposed. The faint glow illuminated the walls, revealing something she hadn't noticed before. There were words, scratched into the stone like a warning, etched so deep that they almost seemed alive. You can never leave. Mia's heart skipped a beat as the words seemed to crawl across the walls, following her gaze, almost mocking her. They weren't just words, they were a message, a truth she had been trying to avoid. She wanted to turn away to ignore them, but something stopped her. Her eyes locked onto the message, her pulse quickening as the weight of its meaning settled over her. No, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. I can leave. I have to leave. But deep down, she knew that no matter how far she ran, the house would always follow. The watcher, the darkness, it was all part of her now. No matter what she did, it wouldn't end until she faced it. Mia clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. She was done running. She would fight this even if it meant going deeper into the nightmare. She couldn't let the house consume her. She couldn't let the darkness win. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that might offer a clue, a way out. The walls were bare except for the strange words, but the floor beneath her feet was different. It wasn't solid like before. It was cracked, with jagged edges that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. And then she saw it. In the center of the room, a door. It had always been there, but it hadn't registered in her mind until now. It was nothing special, just an ordinary wooden door, framed in cold iron. But something about it drew her in. Mia took a tentative step toward it. The air felt heavier the closer she got, thick with a sense of impending danger. She reached out, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold doorknob. As soon as her fingers touched the metal, the door seemed to sigh as if it were alive, its creaking hinges sending a shiver up her spine. She pulled it open. Beyond the door was a hallway stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting her image back at her. But there was something off about the reflections. They weren't quite right. At first, Mia couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but then she noticed the subtle difference. Her reflection, her own face, wasn't smiling. It wasn't even neutral. It was twisted into a grotesque, distorted version of itself, a cold, emotionless mask staring back at her. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that the reflection wasn't just an image, it was a shadow, a part of her that had been hidden, something she had buried deep within. Mia stepped into the hallway, her pulse racing. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this place. But as she walked, the reflections in the mirrors began to change. At first, they simply distorted, stretching and warping as she passed. But soon, the faces in the mirrors began to move, not following her every motion but making their own. They grinned at her, their eyes narrowing with malice. "Run," a voice whispered, echoing from one of the mirrors. Mia spun around, but there was no one there. "Run, Mia. It's the only way." She backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. What was happening? Why was this happening? But as she moved, the reflections grew more restless. Some of them began to pound against the glass, desperate to break free. Others reached out with pale, twisted hands as if trying to pull her into the mirror. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The hallway felt like it was closing in on her, the mirrors reflecting back every fear she had ever had, each one more distorted than the last. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, the sound of her breath loud in her ears. The reflections seemed to follow her, their faces contorting in grotesque ways. Her heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her legs burning with the effort. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop. But the hallway stretched on endlessly. No matter how far she ran, the door she had entered from seemed farther away. The reflections in the mirrors multiplied, each one a different version of her, some with twisted expressions, others with hollow eyes, all of them silent, watching her. And then she saw something. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood, cloaked in shadow. She couldn't see its face, but it felt familiar, like a part of her she had long forgotten. It took a step forward, and the air seemed to freeze. The mirrors around Mia cracked, shattering into thousands of pieces, but the figure remained standing, unfazed. Mia stopped. The world seemed to blur around her as she stared at the figure, her heart in her throat. It wasn't moving, but she could feel its presence, its power, pressing against her. "I've been waiting," the figure said, its voice a cold whisper. Mia's legs trembled as she took a step back. The shadows that had once been distant now surrounded her, closing in. The air grew colder, heavier. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. "I can't let this happen. I won't become this." The figure tilted its head, its form shifting slightly as though contemplating her words. And then in an instant it was gone, disappearing into the air like smoke. But Mia knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Mia stood still, her heart racing as the air around her began to settle. The shadowy figure had vanished, but the dread it left behind lingered, clinging to her like a second skin. The hallway, once filled with the echo of her frantic footsteps, was now eerily silent, save for the sound of her own breath. She was alone, but she felt far from safe. Her mind reeled with the sight of the figure, its words still echoing in her head. "I've been waiting. Waiting for what? What was it waiting for?" As Mia tried to steady her breathing, she realized something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. She wasn't truly alone. The walls, the mirrors, the very space around her seemed to be watching. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of her eye felt like an unseen presence, waiting to strike. She turned in a circle, her eyes scanning the hallway. The mirrors that lined the walls now felt like prisons, each one reflecting her image back to her, but always with that slight distortion, always with something wrong. She felt trapped, as though each reflection held a piece of her soul, a part of her she wasn't ready to confront. Suddenly, one of the mirrors flickered. The image within it twisted, warping into a new form, another version of her, but this time the reflection was smiling. Not a kind smile, but a cruel, mocking grin that spread across its face like a sinister mask. Mia's pulse quickened. She staggered back, her eyes fixed on the mirror, unwilling to look away. The reflection smiled wider, its teeth sharp, jagged. The eyes were black, empty, like hollow pits. Then it spoke. Do you really think you can escape? Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her voice, was unmistakable. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. With a surge of panic, Mia turned away from the mirror, her eyes darting down the hallway for any sign of a way out. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, an endless loop of distorted reflections and cold, empty space. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her, thick and suffocating, like the world was collapsing around her. Every step she took seemed to take her further into the void, deeper into the trap she had created for herself. It was happening again. The darkness, the shadowy figure, the fear. It was all returning, creeping up on her from all sides, tightening its grip on her mind. Mia swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. She had to move. She had to keep moving or she would be swallowed whole by whatever this place was. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another, each one more hesitant than the last. But then she heard it. A whisper, soft and slithering, curling around her like smoke. Mia? Her body froze, the sound of her name falling from the air like a warning. She looked around, but there was no one there. Mia, the voice came again, this time from behind her. Her head snapped around, but still, nothing. Who's there? She demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper didn't answer. Instead, the mirrors seemed to shimmer, their surfaces rippling like water. Mia stepped back, her pulse hammering in her ears. She was starting to lose her grip on reality, the line between what was real and what wasn't blurring with each passing second. The air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive force. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and for a split second, she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. A shadow. A figure barely visible in the dim light. She turned quickly, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the endless hallway, the mirrors, and the silence. But she wasn't alone. She could feel it. The shadows were closing in on her, tightening their grip. She spun around again, her breath coming faster now, as though she were being suffocated. The hallway stretched, bending at the edges like it was warping into something unnatural. She could feel the walls pressing in, squeezing the air from her lungs. A low growl echoed through the hallway, low and guttural, like an animal lurking just out of sight. It was the sound of something hungry, something that wanted her, needed her. Mia's chest tightened as the sound grew louder. She looked up, her eyes wild, and saw it. The shadows, no longer just shapes in the corner of her vision, had come alive. They writhed and twisted, creeping down the walls like dark tendrils reaching for her, their fingers curling in the air. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were something worse. Mia stumbled backward, her hands scrambling for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The darkness was swallowing the hallway, crawling across the floor, the walls, the mirrors, all of it. And then the figure appeared again, the one she had seen at the end of the hall. This time it wasn't just standing there. It was moving toward her. With each step, it seemed to grow larger, its silhouette more defined, its presence more suffocating. Mia's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't breathe. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice ragged with terror. But the figure didn't stop. It was coming for her, and there was nowhere to run. As it reached out toward her, Mia knew there was no escape. The figure's hand closed around her wrist, cold as ice, its grip unbreakable. She gasped, the darkness closing in on her from all sides. And then everything went black. Mia awoke with a start, gasping for air as if she had been holding her breath for an eternity. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, each inhale shallow, her heart pounding so hard that it felt like it might burst from her chest. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filled the room. It wasn't the hallway anymore. It wasn't the twisted, warped world she had just been trapped in. But the fear, the dread, still lingered as if it had seeped into her very bones. She was lying on a cold, hard surface, her arms splayed out beside her. She pushed herself up, her head spinning. The world felt too still. Mia slowly stood, her legs weak beneath her, her body trembling. The room she was in was familiar, yet somehow foreign. It looked like the house, but different. The walls were smooth and unmarked, no mirrors, no shadows. But the stillness, it was suffocating. She walked cautiously toward the door, each step hesitant, as though waiting for something to happen. When she reached it, she paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Something in her gut twisted. Was she truly awake? The memory of the shadow figure, the whispers, the crushing fear, it all came rushing back to her. Mia didn't know if she could trust anything anymore. She didn't know if she was still trapped in the nightmare or if this was another layer, another trick her mind was playing on her. Taking a deep breath, she turned the doorknob and stepped into the hallway. Everything seemed normal. The walls were intact, the floor clean. But as she took a step forward, the air seemed to shift. She could feel it, the weight of something watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dark, distorted figures from the hallway behind her. Nothing. Just silence. Mia felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This house felt wrong. She didn't know how or why, but every instinct screamed that something was deeply off. She walked down the hallway, each step careful, deliberate. The silence was oppressive, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or maybe waiting for someone. A low creak sounded from behind her, too soft for her to immediately pinpoint. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. Her heart pounded in her chest. Mia moved faster now, her mind racing, her senses heightened to every little sound. She had to get out. This place, whatever it was, felt like it was closing in on her. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. She passed the doors to the rooms she had entered before. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Each one felt like a potential trap, like the house was luring her back into its web, its clutches. But then she saw it. The door at the end of the hallway. The door she had never opened before. It was a simple wooden door, no different from any of the others, yet it held an almost magnetic pull. She couldn't explain it, but something about it felt like it was meant for her. She approached it cautiously, her breath shallow, her fingers cold as she reached for the knob. For a moment she hesitated. This could be the exit, or it could be the final trap. Mia closed her eyes, trying to steady her thoughts. She couldn't keep running forever. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to get out of this nightmare, she had to face whatever lay behind that door. With one last breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. It was dark inside, but there was something else. A faint glow, soft, almost imperceptible, pulsed in the distance. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was unsettlingly neutral, like the calm before a storm. Mia stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The air was thick, heavy, and it felt as though the walls were closing in around her with each passing second. She moved toward the source of the glow, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. And then she saw it. A mirror. The faint glow emanated from the edges of the glass, casting a soft light that seemed to shimmer and shift, like it was alive. Mia froze. The mirror was unlike any she had seen before. It was large, full-length, and it was framed in intricate designs, with sharp angles that seemed to cut into her very soul. And in that moment, Mia knew. She wasn't just looking at a mirror. She was looking at a doorway back into the darkness. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had come full circle. This wasn't an escape. This was the endgame. She wasn't running from the house anymore. She was running from herself. As Mia stared into the mirror, her reflection started to shift, morphing once again into something twisted. Her own face smiled back at her, but the smile was empty, hollow, as though it wasn't truly her. The eyes, once her own, were black, devoid of any warmth, any humanity. "You cannot escape," the reflection whispered, its voice soft yet loud in Mia's mind. Mia's heart skipped a beat. The words weren't just a warning, they were the truth. She backed away from the mirror, her body trembling. But the reflection didn't stop. It grew, spreading out of the glass and into the room, becoming more and more real with every passing second. "Mia," the reflection spoke again, this time with a voice that was unmistakably hers. "It's time." And then everything went dark. Story 2. The cabin had been Aaron's idea of escape. Nestled deep in the heart of a forest nobody cared to name, it was the perfect place for a man trying to outrun his past. No phone calls, no emails, no people. Just silence. For a man like Aaron, it was supposed to be the solution to everything. The cabin itself was nothing special. A single-story structure with creaky wooden floors, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom that smelled faintly of damp wood. Outside, a narrow dirt trail led back to the highway, winding through dense woods that swallowed the sunlight long before evening came. The locals called it Silent Grove, though nobody could agree why. The realtor's warning had been odd. "It's peaceful," she said, her voice dropping, "but it can get unsettling out there. You might hear things." "What kind of things?" Aaron asked, amused. The realtor hesitated, her expression hard to read. It's an old place. You know how cabins are, wood creaks, wind whistles through the gaps. It's probably nothing. Aaron didn't care. He was desperate to get away, to leave behind the suffocating noise of the city and the endless reminders of what he'd lost. The cabin felt like his last chance to find some kind of peace. But now, standing in the middle of the living room on his 7th night there, Aaron felt anything but peaceful. The sound started faintly, so soft he almost dismissed it. It was like a breath, a murmur carried on the wind. He told himself it was just the old wood settling, or maybe the trees shifting outside. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew more distinct, more deliberate. Aaron? The voice was so soft he wasn't sure he'd heard it. He froze, his heart pounding, straining to listen. Nothing. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. Get a grip, he muttered. The isolation was getting to him. He'd been alone too long, with only the forest for company. Solitude could mess with your head, he reminded himself. But the sound came again, clearer this time. Aaron? He spun around, his eyes darting to the window. The curtains were drawn, but he felt exposed, like someone, or something, was watching him. He grabbed the flashlight from the counter and switched it on, the beam cutting through the dark corners of the room. Aaron, the voice whispered again. It was impossible. There was no one here. He had locked the doors, checked the windows. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and he hadn't seen a single soul since he arrived. He stepped toward the door, his breath quickening. He flung it open, the flashlight beam sweeping across the empty clearing outside. The night was still, the trees unmoving. Who's there? He shouted into the darkness. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No answer. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. He leaned against it, his heart racing. It was just his imagination, he told himself. The isolation, the quiet, it was playing tricks on him. But deep down he didn't believe it. Aaron tried to shake it off, returning to his desk. The blank page on his laptop stared back at him, a mocking reminder of his inability to focus. He had come here to write, to lose himself in his work, but so far, he hadn't managed a single word. The whisper came again, louder now. This time it wasn't just his name. Leave, it hissed, the voice cold and sharp like broken glass. Aaron's blood ran cold. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Who's there? He demanded, his voice trembling. The room was silent. The flashlight beam shook in his unsteady hands as he searched the cabin. He checked every corner, every shadow, even the small crawl space under the bed. Nothing. And yet, the feeling persisted, that suffocating sense that he wasn't alone. He decided to sleep with the light on that night. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind outside made him jump. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to answer. At some point he must have dozed off because he woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, a gentle tap-tap-tap that seemed almost polite. Aaron sat up, his heart pounding. He reached for his phone, but the screen was black. The knocking came again, louder this time. Aaron grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door. Who's there? He called, trying to sound braver than he felt. No answer. The knocking grew more insistent, more aggressive. He flung the door open, the flashlight beam slicing through the night. The clearing was empty. Aaron stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold air. The forest loomed around him, silent and still. That's when he saw it. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam, stood a shadow. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long. And it wasn't moving. Aaron stared, frozen in place as the whisper returned. Leave, it said, the voice echoing in his head. Before it's too late. He stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking it. He leaned against it, his chest heaving, his mind racing. This wasn't just his imagination. Something was out there. Something that knew his name. The whisper came again, this time from inside the cabin. Aaron stood frozen, his back pressed against the door, his knuckles white as they gripped the flashlight. The whisper seemed to slither through the air, wrapping itself around him like an invisible fog. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. His pulse thundered in his ears as his eyes darted around the room. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting with the flickering beam of his flashlight. Every creak of the wooden floor, Every groan of the cabin's old frame felt amplified, each sound pushing his fear to the edge of panic. The voice came again, soft yet unmistakable. "Aaron?" It was coming from the bedroom. His throat felt dry as he forced himself to move, step by agonizing step, toward the doorway. The beam of the flashlight wavered as his hands shook, illuminating the narrow hallway ahead. He hesitated at the threshold, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He could feel it, something waiting for him on the other side. With a deep breath, he swung the flashlight into the room. The bed was empty, the windows locked tight, the curtains drawn. Nothing looked out of place, yet the air felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. The whisper came again, this time behind him. "Aaron?" He spun around, the flashlight jerking wildly. The living room was empty. He could see the front door from here, the lock still secure. But the sound didn't make sense. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a feeling, a presence crawling beneath his skin. "Aaron, leave." The voice was sharper now, more insistent. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. The flashlight beam trembled as he scanned the room again, desperate for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Then he saw it. The closet door. It was open just a crack. He was certain it had been shut earlier. He stared at the dark sliver of space, his mind racing. The voice had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that made your thoughts louder, more dangerous. He stepped closer to the closet, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers brushing against the rough wood of the door. Slowly he pushed it open. The closet was empty. Aaron exhaled shakily, his relief short-lived as he noticed something at the back of the closet. A small door, barely 3 feet high, set into the wall. It wasn't there before. He crouched down, the flashlight beam illuminating the tiny, ancient-looking door. It was covered in scratches as if something, or someone, had tried to claw their way through. His hand hovered over the rusted handle, his mind screaming at him to stop, to walk away. But he couldn't. Something was pulling him, a morbid curiosity he couldn't resist. He gripped the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The air that wafted out was stale and cold, carrying a faint metallic scent that made his stomach turn. He shined the flashlight into the tunnel, but the beam barely penetrated the shadows. It was like the darkness was alive, swallowing the light whole. "Aaron?" The whisper echoed from the tunnel, louder than ever. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound wasn't just in his ears, it was inside his head, crawling through his thoughts. He slammed the tiny door shut, scrambling to his feet and backing away. The whisper stopped, but then the knocking began. It wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was coming from the tiny door inside the closet. Aaron stood frozen, the sound growing louder, more insistent. He couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his phone, desperate to call for help, but it was still dead. Suddenly the knocking stopped. He waited, holding his breath, his ears straining for any sound. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. And then the bedroom door creaked open. Aaron turned, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The door was swinging slowly as if pushed by an invisible hand. "Leave," the voice hissed louder than ever. Aaron didn't need to be told again. He bolted out of the room, his feet pounding against the wooden floor. He didn't stop until he reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. But when he threw the door open, he stopped cold. The forest was gone. The clearing outside the cabin had disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. It wasn't night, it was something else, something unnatural. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the moon was nowhere to be seen. "Aaron?" The voice was behind him now, closer than ever. He turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The figure stood in the middle of the living room, its tall, impossibly thin frame shrouded in shadows. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank, featureless void. Aaron tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, long, bony fingers stretching toward him. The room seemed to warp around it, the walls bending and twisting as the air filled with a low, guttural hum. "Aaron," it said, its voice echoing in his mind. "You were warned." The flashlight flickered and went out. When the light vanished, Aaron's world collapsed into complete darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was an oppressive, all-consuming void that pressed against him, making it impossible to breathe, to think, to move. The figure's presence loomed in the blackness, its voice reverberating inside his skull like a haunting melody that refused to fade. Aaron? The voice stretched out his name, slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with malice. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead, frozen in place. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, a desperate drumbeat against the crushing silence. Then, without warning, the darkness shifted. It wasn't light, not exactly, but a dim, eerie glow that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It illuminated just enough for Aaron to see the living room again, but everything looked wrong. The furniture was warped, their shapes twisted and unnatural, as though they were reflections in a funhouse mirror. The walls pulsed faintly as if they were alive, breathing in sync with some unseen force. The figure was gone. Aaron stood in the center of the room, trembling, his flashlight useless in his hand. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The oppressive feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but as soon as he stepped outside, he froze. The cabin was no longer surrounded by trees. Instead, an endless field stretched out before him, its grass a sickly gray that seemed to writhe in the faint, unnatural glow. The sky above was pitch black, devoid of stars or a moon, yet the horizon was lined with a faint, pulsing red light that made his skin crawl. He turned back to the cabin, his stomach dropping. The building had changed, its wooden frame now covered in deep, jagged carvings that glowed faintly with the same eerie red light. The windows were gone, replaced by gaping holes that seemed to stare back at him like empty eye sockets. Aaron's breaths came in shallow gasps as he backed away. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but where would he go? There was no road, no forest, just the endless expanse of that sickly, shifting field. And then he heard it. The sound started as a faint rustling, like dry leaves scraping against each other. It came from the direction of the horizon, growing louder with every passing second. Aaron squinted, trying to make out the source of the noise, but the distance blurred with the pulsing red light. The rustling became a low roar, and Aaron realized it wasn't leaves. It was movement. Something, or somethings were coming. He turned back to the cabin, his mind racing. The distorted building was the only structure in sight, and as much as it terrified him, it felt safer than the open field. He bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind him and sliding the deadbolt into place. The whisper returned immediately, louder and more aggressive. "You shouldn't have stayed." Aaron spun around, his back against the door. The room was darker now, the faint glow from the walls flickering like a dying flame. Shadows swirled in the corners, growing thicker, more tangible. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The whisper didn't answer. Instead, the shadows began to coalesce, twisting together into a shape that sent icy tendrils of fear down his spine. The figure was back, taller and more menacing than before. Its featureless face seemed to ripple, as though something was trying to push through from the other side. Its long, spindly fingers flexed, the joints cracking loudly in the silence. "You were warned," it said, its voice deeper now, more resonant. "But you chose to stay." "I don't even know what's happening," Aaron cried, his voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head as if considering him. "You were brought here for a reason," it said. "And now there is no escape." Aaron felt a surge of anger through his fear. "Brought here? I came here on my own." The figure let out a sound that could have been a laugh, low and hollow. "Did you? Or were you led here, step by step, choice by choice, until you stood exactly where we needed you?" Aaron shook his head, his mind racing. None of this made sense. The cabin, the whispering, the figure, how could this be happening? The whisper returned, louder now, echoing in his head. "The door," it said. Aaron blinked. "What door?" The figure pointed a long, bony finger toward the hallway. The bedroom door was open again, and beyond it, the tiny door in the closet stood ajar. A faint red glow seeped out, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. "No," Aaron said, shaking his head. "I'm not going back in there." The figure didn't move, but the walls began to shift again, closing in on him. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavier, suffocating. "The door," the whisper insisted. Aaron stumbled toward the hallway, his legs barely supporting him. The tiny door in the closet seemed to pulse with an unnatural light, each beat matching the frantic rhythm of his heart. He crouched down, staring into the dark tunnel beyond the door. The metallic scent was stronger now, mingling with something else, something that smelled like decay. The whisper grew louder. Go. Aaron gritted his teeth, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the tiny door. He didn't know what was waiting for him in that tunnel, but he knew he had no other choice. With a deep breath, he crawled inside. Aaron's shoulders scraped against the rough stone walls of the tunnel as he crawled deeper into the suffocating darkness. The flashlight dangled from his wrist, swinging wildly with each shaky movement, its dim beam barely illuminating the narrow space ahead. The metallic scent was stronger now, mixing with a damp, earthy smell that clung to his skin. His palms scraped against jagged edges, the sting of shallow cuts making him wince, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Behind him, the whisper persisted, louder and more insistent. Keep going, Aaron. The voice wasn't his own thoughts. It was alive, sentient, threading itself into his mind like a parasite. He gritted his teeth, trying to block it out, but the harder he tried, the clearer it became. Ahead lies the truth you seek, it said. Or the end. Aaron didn't know which terrified him more. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, the walls closing in tighter with every inch he moved. His breathing grew labored, his chest heaving against the constricting space. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, the tunnel opened up. Aaron tumbled forward, landing hard on a stone floor. The air was colder here, thick with a musty odor that made his stomach churn. He sat up, shining the flashlight around the space. He was in a circular chamber, its walls lined with crude carvings that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked directly at them. The red glow from the tunnel was stronger here, emanating from the floor in strange, pulsating patterns that resembled veins. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, a jagged slab of black stone that seemed to absorb the light. Aaron's heart sank as he noticed something lying on the altar. It was a book, its cover bound in what looked disturbingly like aged, weathered skin. The air around it seemed to hum, a low, vibrating energy that made his teeth ache. No, Aaron muttered, shaking his head. I'm not touching that. The whisper came again, sharper now. Take it. Aaron backed away, his hands raised defensively. No. I don't know what's happening, but I'm not part of it. I didn't ask for this. The chamber seemed to tremble, the carvings on the walls pulsating with a sinister rhythm. You don't understand, the voice said, colder than before. You were chosen. Chosen for what? Aaron shouted, his voice echoing in the chamber. The response didn't come in words. Instead, the air grew heavier, the low hum rising to a deafening roar. Shadows began to pour from the walls, coalescing into shapes that defied comprehension. They weren't human, at least not entirely. Their twisted, malformed bodies writhed as they advanced toward him, their glowing eyes fixed on the altar. Aaron's chest tightened as the shadows surrounded him, their presence suffocating. He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight shaking wildly as he pointed it at them. The beam passed through their forms as though they were made of smoke. You don't have a choice, the voice hissed. The shadows closed in, pushing him toward the altar. He stumbled backward, his feet sliding on the slick, veined floor. The book seemed to pulse, its faint heartbeat echoing in his ears. Aaron's mind raced. Every instinct told him to run, to escape this nightmare, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The shadows pressed closer, their formless bodies crackling with dark energy. Take it, the voice commanded, louder than ever. With no other options, Aaron reached out, his trembling fingers brushing against the book's rough cover. The moment he touched it, the chamber erupted in a blinding red light. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissipating like smoke in the wind. The carvings on the walls twisted violently before settling into new shapes, shapes that resembled faces, their hollow eyes watching him with a mix of pity and malice. Aaron stumbled back, clutching the book to his chest. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even more oppressive. The altar began to sink into the floor, the veins of red light dimming with each passing second. Then the chamber started to change. The walls cracked and groaned, shifting as though they were alive. Aaron backed away, his heart pounding. The carvings on the walls melted into the stone, replaced by deep, jagged lines that glowed faintly. The floor beneath him began to move, tilting and trembling as the chamber reshaped itself. Aaron clung to the book, his mind reeling as the space around him folded in on itself. He closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. When he opened them, he was no longer in the chamber. He was standing in the middle of a vast, desolate landscape. The ground was cracked and dry, stretching out endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. In the distance, jagged mountains loomed, their peaks shrouded in dark clouds. Aaron turned in a slow circle, his breath catching in his throat. The book in his hands felt heavier now, its hum louder and more insistent. "You've taken the first step," the voice said, softer now. Aaron looked around, his heart racing. "Where am I?" The voice didn't answer, but in the distance something was moving. Aaron squinted into the horizon, his stomach twisting as he tried to make sense of the movement. The air in this place was heavy and oppressive, the red sky casting everything in an eerie, otherworldly hue. Whatever was coming toward him moved unnaturally, its jagged, stuttering motions unlike anything he'd ever seen. The book in his hands felt alive, vibrating faintly as though reacting to the approaching presence. Aaron's instinct was to drop it and run, but the moment he considered it, the voice returned, sharp and commanding. "Don't let go." The presence grew closer and Aaron's legs locked in place. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to move, to escape, but his feet refused to cooperate. Things became clearer as they closed the distance. They weren't human. The figures were tall and gaunt, their skin a mottled gray that glistened in the dim light. Their faces were stretched and featureless, with hollow depressions where eyes should have been. They didn't walk so much as glide, their limbs bending at impossible angles as they advanced. Aaron's breaths came in shallow gasps. "What are they?" "They are drawn to the book," the voice whispered. "And to you?" The figures stopped a few yards away, their heads tilting unnaturally as though studying him. Aaron clutched the book tighter, the rough texture of its cover biting into his palms. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements stuttering like a broken film reel. It raised a long bony hand pointing at the book. "You must open it," the voice instructed. Aaron's head whipped around, searching for the source of the voice. It wasn't coming from the figures or even the air around him. It was inside him, threading through his thoughts like a parasite. "Open it," the voice repeated louder now. Aaron hesitated, his hands trembling as he slowly lifted the book's cover. The air around him grew colder, the oppressive silence broken by a low, resonating hum that seemed to emanate from the pages themselves. Inside, the text wasn't written in any language Aaron recognized. The symbols were jagged and chaotic, shifting and twisting as his eyes tried to focus on them. His head throbbed, the pain intensifying with each passing second. The figures moved closer, their hollow faces turning toward the book. "Read it," the voice commanded. "I can't," Aaron stammered. "I don't understand it." The hum grew louder, vibrating through his chest. The symbols on the page began to shift, aligning themselves into something legible. A single sentence that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "Speak the words and the way will open." Aaron shook his head, panic surging through him. "No. I don't know what this will do." The figures loomed over him now, their presence suffocating. One of them reached out, its long fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of pain through his body. "Speak the words," the voice urged, its tone growing harsher. Aaron's lips trembled as he stared at the text. The symbols seemed to burn into his mind, searing themselves into his memory. Against his better judgment, the words spilled out of him, his voice shaky and hoarse. The moment he finished, the ground beneath him erupted. A deafening roar filled the air as the earth cracked open, a jagged fissure spreading outward in all directions. The figures recoiled, their bodies dissolving into wisps of shadow that were sucked into the growing chasm. Aaron stumbled backward, barely managing to keep his footing. From the depths of the fissure, a blinding light shot into the sky, piercing the blood-red clouds above. The light wasn't comforting, it was sharp, cold, and unrelenting, cutting through the landscape like a blade. Aaron shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as the light began to take shape. It formed a towering figure, its body made of the same pulsating energy as the book. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the air with a deep, resonating hum that rattled Aaron's bones. "You have called me forth," the figure said, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers layered together. Aaron's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground, the book slipping from his hands. "I didn't mean to. I didn't have a choice." The figure tilted its head, its glowing form shifting like a flickering flame. Choice is an illusion, bound by forces you cannot comprehend. Aaron felt tears streaking down his face, his chest heaving with sobs. What do you want from me? The figure extended a hand, its fingers elongating into jagged tendrils of light. You have opened the path, it said, and now you must walk it. Before Aaron could respond, the tendrils wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. The light burned against his skin, but he couldn't scream. His voice was gone, swallowed by the overwhelming force of the entity's presence. The fissure widened beneath him, revealing a swirling vortex of shadows and light. The tendrils tightened, pulling him closer to the edge. Aaron's mind raced, 1,000 questions and fears colliding in a chaotic storm. As the vortex swallowed him whole, the last thing he saw was the book, its pages fluttering wildly as it was consumed by the same blinding light. And then everything went black. Aaron awoke to the sensation of cold stone beneath him and the faint echo of dripping water somewhere in the distance. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as he tried to sit up. The air was dense and humid, carrying the metallic tang of blood and something far worse, decay. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. He wasn't in the barren wasteland anymore. The red sky, the jagged mountains, the figures with their hollow faces, they were gone. Instead, he found himself in a cavernous room, its walls slick with moisture and covered in the same shifting carvings he'd seen before. The room pulsed faintly as though it were alive. Aaron's gaze fell on the center of the space, where a massive circular pit yawned like a gaping wound in the earth. Thick, black tendrils slithered out from its depths, writhing and twisting as though searching for something, or someone. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the wet stone. No. This can't be real. But it was. The book was gone, but its presence lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He could feel it as though it had imprinted itself on his very soul. From the shadows, a voice broke the silence. You've crossed the threshold. Aaron whipped his head around, searching for the source. It wasn't the same voice that had guided him before. This one was deeper, rougher, carrying an edge that made his skin crawl. Who's there? He called out, his voice trembling. The shadows shifted, coalescing into a figure that stepped forward with deliberate slowness. It was human-shaped but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements unnervingly smooth. Its face was obscured, as though the darkness itself clung to it. You don't belong here, the figure said, its tone devoid of emotion. Aaron pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking. I didn't ask to be here. I don't even know what's happening. The figure tilted its head, studying him. Ignorance doesn't absolve you. You've touched what was forbidden. You've spoken the words. Now you are marked. Marked? Aaron repeated, his heart sinking. Marked for what? The figure extended a hand, and Aaron recoiled instinctively. But instead of striking, the figure pointed toward the pit. For them, it said. The tendrils reacted instantly, surging upward as though they'd been waiting for acknowledgement. Their movements were frantic, desperate, clawing at the air as they reached for Aaron. He stumbled back, his breath hitching. No. Get away from me. The figure's voice remained calm, almost disinterested. The pit hungers for the marked. It always has. Aaron's mind raced. He had to find a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. But the walls of the cavern were smooth and featureless, offering no footholds or exits. The only way forward was through the figure and the pit. The tendrils stretched farther, their movements growing more aggressive. One of them lashed out, grazing Aaron's arm. He cried out as searing pain shot through him, the wound oozing a black substance instead of blood. What's happening to me? He screamed, clutching his arm. You're changing, the figure said, its voice unwavering. The mark isn't just a curse. It's a transformation. Aaron's breathing quickened as he noticed the black substance spreading, crawling across his skin like living ink. He shook his arm violently, trying to stop it, but it was no use. You must resist, the figure said, its tone almost mocking. If you can. Aaron glared at it, anger flaring through his fear. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form unraveling into tendrils of shadow that merged with the cavern walls. Aaron was alone again, or so he thought. The pit rumbled, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor. From its depths came a voice, low and echoing, each word reverberating in Aaron's skull. Come closer. No? Aaron shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm not coming anywhere near you." The tendrils lashed out again, this time wrapping around his legs. Aaron screamed, clawing at the ground as they dragged him toward the pit. The black substance on his arms spread faster, seeping into his veins and clouding his vision. "You can't fight it," the voice from the pit said. "You are ours now." Aaron's fingers scraped against the stone floor, desperate for anything to hold on to. But the ground was smooth, offering no resistance. As he neared the edge of the pit, the air grew colder, the smell of decay almost unbearable. Aaron's tears blurred his vision, but through the haze, he saw something moving within the pit, something massive and shifting, its form too monstrous to comprehend. A single eye opened within the darkness, its gaze locking onto Aaron. "Do you see now?" the voice asked. Aaron's screams echoed through the cavern as the tendrils pulled him over the edge. And then there was silence. Aaron's scream was swallowed by the void as he plunged into the pit. Darkness wrapped around him, thick and suffocating, making it impossible to tell if he was falling or floating. The air was freezing, yet it burned his skin, each breath he took laced with something sharp and metallic. His mind reeled, unable to process what was happening. The black tendrils that had dragged him over the edge were gone, yet he could still feel their presence, as if they had burrowed under his skin. Then, with a jarring thud, he landed on something solid. Aaron groaned, his body aching from the impact. He opened his eyes, only to find himself surrounded by a vast, empty expanse. The ground beneath him was a smooth, obsidian surface that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. Above him, the sky, or what passed for a sky, was a swirling mass of shadows and faint, flickering lights. "You're still alive," the voice said, cutting through the silence. Aaron pushed himself up, his legs trembling as he stood. "Where am I?" he demanded, his voice echoing strangely in the emptiness. "This is the threshold," the voice replied. "The place between worlds?" Aaron turned, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Just the endless blackness and the faint hum of something ancient and alive. "I don't want to be here," he said, his voice cracking. "I just want to go home." The ground beneath him trembled, a low vibration that sent a chill down his spine. "There is no home," the voice said, its tone almost mocking. "Not for you. Not anymore." Aaron clenched his fists, anger bubbling up through his fear. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." "You didn't have to," the voice replied. "The moment you touched the book, your fate was sealed." Aaron's stomach turned at the mention of the book. "Where is it?" "The book? What happened to it?" "It's no longer your concern," the voice said. "Your focus should be on survival." "Survival?" Aaron repeated, his heart pounding. "What does that mean?" As if in response, the ground beneath him began to crack. Jagged lines spread outward, glowing faintly with an eerie, crimson light. The hum grew louder, more intense, vibrating through Aaron's body. And then they appeared. Creatures began to emerge from the cracks, their forms twisting and writhing as though they were made of shadows and fire. They had no discernible faces, but their glowing eyes fixed on Aaron with a hunger that made his blood run cold. "Run," the voice said, its tone urgent. Aaron didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the obsidian surface. The creatures surged after him, their movements unnaturally fast and fluid. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted across the endless expanse. No matter how far he ran, the creatures were always right behind him, their guttural growls echoing in his ears. "You can't outrun them," the voice said, cutting through his panic. Aaron glanced over his shoulder, his heart sinking as he saw the creatures closing in. "Then what am I supposed to do?" he shouted. "Face them." Aaron skidded to a stop, nearly losing his footing. "Face them? Are you insane? They'll kill me." "Perhaps," the voice replied. "But running will only prolong the inevitable." The creatures slowed, circling him like predators stalking their prey. Aaron's chest heaved as he backed away, his mind racing. The black substance on his arm began to pulse, spreading further across his skin. It burned, but at the same time, it filled him with a strange, almost intoxicating energy. "Use it," the voice said. Aaron stared at his arm, the black veins twisting and writhing under his skin. "What is this?" "It's a part of you now," the voice replied. "And it's your only chance." The creatures lunged. Aaron raised his arm instinctively, and the black substance erupted from his skin, forming a jagged, pulsating shield. The first creature collided with it, its body disintegrating into ash with a piercing shriek. The others hesitated, their glowing eyes narrowing as they re-evaluated their prey. Aaron stared at the shield in disbelief. What is this? It's your mark, the voice said. Your power. But be warned, it comes at a cost. The creatures attacked again, their movements more coordinated this time. Aaron swung the shield, the black substance shifting and morphing with his movements. Each strike sent shockwaves through the air, obliterating the creatures on contact. But with each use, the black substance spread further across his body, the pain intensifying. Aaron fell to his knees, his body trembling. The remaining creatures retreated, their forms dissolving into the shadows. You've survived, the voice said, its tone almost approving. Aaron glared at the empty expanse around him. What cost? He demanded, his voice hoarse. What's happening to me? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath him began to shift again, the cracks closing as the crimson light faded. A door appeared in the distance, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols from the book. Your path continues, the voice said. Aaron staggered to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He had no choice. He walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. Aaron reached the door, his every step feeling like an eternity. The weight of the journey was crushing him. His body was exhausted, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The black substance on his skin had spread further, now covering his entire arm and creeping up his neck. It pulsed with a malevolent rhythm, almost as if it were alive, feeding off his fear. He stopped before the door, his hand hovering over the cold surface. The symbols etched into it glowed faintly, their designs shifting, just like the carvings in the cavern. You have to open it, the voice said, once again breaking the silence. Aaron didn't want to. He wanted to scream, to lash out at whatever force had trapped him in this nightmare, but he knew better than to resist. Every instinct in his body screamed that he had no choice. He placed his hand on the door. The moment his skin made contact, the door trembled violently. The symbols began to glow brighter, casting a sickly light that filled the air with an oppressive energy. The temperature dropped, and Aaron could feel his breath catch in his throat as a low, resonating hum filled the space. The door slowly creaked open. On the other side was a void, nothingness, vast and endless. But as the door fully opened, a shadowy figure stepped through, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness. It moved with an unnerving fluidity, its presence more terrifying than anything Aaron had faced so far. The figure's face remained hidden, its form obscured by the shadows that seemed to warp around it. Aaron stepped back instinctively, his pulse racing. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure didn't respond at first. Instead, it took another step forward, and the shadows surrounding it deepened, swirling like a storm. "I am the Keeper," it finally said, its voice deep and hollow like a distant echo. "Keeper of what?" Aaron asked, his voice trembling. "Keeper of the path," the figure replied. "The path you've chosen, whether you realize it or not." Aaron shook his head, his thoughts clouded by the overwhelming sense of dread. "I didn't choose anything. I'm just trying to survive." The Keeper tilted its head, the shadows around it flickering. "Survival is a choice too. And you've made yours." Aaron's mind raced as he tried to understand the meaning behind the words. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his throat tight. The Keeper's voice softened, though it carried the weight of inevitability. "You have come this far, but your journey is far from over. The mark you bear is not just a symbol, it is your key. And now, you must decide what to do with it." "I don't want it," Aaron said quickly, pulling his arm away from the Keeper. "I never asked for any of this." "The mark is a part of you now," the Keeper said. "It cannot be erased. It can only be wielded." "Wielded?" Aaron's voice cracked. "What do you mean? What does this thing want from me?" The Keeper stepped forward again, the shadows pulling back to reveal more of its form. It had no eyes, just a black void where its face should have been, as if its very existence was an absence. "The mark is not a gift," it said. "It is a test, a trial that will determine if you are worthy." "Worthy of what?" Aaron's voice was barely a whisper. "Worthy of power," the Keeper replied. "Worthy of the change that is coming. But first, you must prove yourself." Aaron's heart sank. "What kind of test? How do I prove myself?" The Keeper raised one hand, and the shadows behind it rippled. The space around them began to shift, the void warping into a new form, an endless labyrinth of corridors and dead ends, each one more suffocating than the last. "You must navigate the maze," the Keeper said. "Find the center where the heart of the mark lies. If you succeed, you will wield its power as your own. If you fail, you will become nothing more than a shadow. No, Aaron stepped back, fear gripping his chest. I can't do this. I don't know how. The keeper's voice hardened. You have no choice. Suddenly, the ground beneath Aaron's feet vanished. He fell, tumbling through the darkness as the walls of the labyrinth closed in around him. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, whispering, clawing at his skin. When he hit the ground, it felt like his bones shattered. His body burned with the force of the impact, but when he tried to move, he found himself trapped in a small, enclosed space. The shadows gathered around him, closing in. He could hear their voices now, faint but distinct, murmurs of those who had failed before him. I won't fail, Aaron whispered to himself, his hands trembling. He had to survive. He had to make it through. But the darkness around him seemed to mock him, pressing in closer with every breath. The mark on his arm burned hotter now, searing his flesh with a pain so intense he could barely think. It was as if the mark itself was testing him, pushing him to the brink. You can't win, a voice whispered from the darkness. You're already ours. Aaron squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices. No, I'm not. I won't be. The darkness shifted again, this time revealing a single glowing door at the end of a narrow passage. The air was thick with dread, but something deep inside him told him that this was his chance. With his heart pounding, Aaron pushed forward, his legs feeling like lead as he stumbled toward the door. Each step felt like an eternity, but he couldn't stop now. He had to reach the center. Aaron's hand reached for the glowing door, the touch sending a shock of cold through his fingertips. The air around him crackled with energy, as though the very fabric of the space was alive and reacting to his presence. He couldn't tell if it was the mark burning through him or the oppressive weight of the shadows closing in, but his entire body felt like it was about to give way. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the darkness like a warning. He stepped into the room beyond, unsure of what to expect. The space was vast, though the edges were obscured by the thick fog swirling at his feet. The air was different here. He could taste the bitterness in his mouth like a metal tang. The ground was slick beneath his boots, and his every step echoed too loudly, bouncing back at him from the unseen corners of the room. What is this place? He muttered to himself. The question slipped out before he could stop it. The voice, now familiar but no less unsettling, answered in a low murmur. The heart of your trial. The place where your fate will be decided. Aaron glanced around, his heart racing. He couldn't see anything in the fog, but the presence of someone, was undeniable, was watching him. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, even though there was no one in sight. The fog parted ahead of him, revealing a massive stone pedestal at the center of the room. Atop it lay a dark, pulsing orb, its surface rippling like liquid. It was the source of the eerie glow that filled the space, casting strange, jagged shadows against the walls. This is it? Aaron asked, stepping closer. His feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the orb. Yes, the voice responded. The heart of the mark. The final test. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the pedestal. The closer he got, the more the orb seemed to resonate, vibrating with a low hum that was almost too intense to bear. It felt like the mark inside him was reacting to it, as though they were connected. Don't touch it, the voice warned. Not yet. Aaron froze, his fingers just inches from the orb. What do you mean, not yet? The mark is a weapon, but it is not yours to wield without cost, the voice said, its tone growing darker. The orb will test your will, your desires, your very soul. Once you touch it, you will be bound to it, and there will be no turning back. A cold shiver ran down Aaron's spine. I don't understand. How can I be sure I'm ready? You cannot. No one can. The voice fell silent, leaving Aaron to confront the orb alone. He stood there, his mind racing. He had come so far, endured so much, but this felt different. This was the moment that would define everything. The power, the choice, it all came down to this. Don't hesitate, the voice urged. The longer you wait, the harder it will become. There is no more time. With a shudder, Aaron reached out and touched the orb. The instant his fingers made contact, everything went black. For a moment, Aaron couldn't tell if he was falling, floating, or trapped in some strange limbo. His body was weightless, disoriented, as if the world around him had ceased to exist. Then images flooded his mind. Visions of places he had never seen, people he had never met, and horrors he couldn't begin to comprehend. Faces twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for mercy. Flames that consumed everything in their path. Whispers of names, old and forgotten, calling to him from the void. He gasped, his chest tightening as he struggled to breathe. The mark on his arm burned, its heat intensifying with each passing second. It felt like it was eating him alive, consuming his very essence. "Make it stop," he pleaded, his voice strained. "I can't take it." The voice responded, but this time it was different, distorted, broken. "It is too late. The mark has claimed you. There is no undoing it." "No?" Aaron shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that now filled his mind. He could no longer tell where the voices ended and his own thoughts began. The ground beneath him shifted, and suddenly he was back in the room with the pedestal, though everything had changed. The orb was no longer on the pedestal. Instead, it was in his hand, its pulse resonating with his heartbeat. The shadows around him had taken form, swirling into grotesque shapes that towered over him. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their mouths twisted into horrible grins. "You belong to us now," one of them said, its voice like 1,000 whispers. "No," Aaron gasped, his voice shaking with terror. "I can't be, this isn't me." But the creatures were closing in, their presence suffocating. He could feel the power of the orb coursing through him, its dark energy flowing like a river inside his veins. "There is no turning back," the voice said, no longer a guide, but a warning. Aaron's fingers clenched around the orb. The power within it surged, and the room exploded with a burst of blinding light. He stumbled back, his vision blurring as the energy in the orb began to twist and shift. And then it stopped. Everything went silent. The creatures vanished, and the shadows receded. Aaron stood alone in the center of the room, the orb still in his hand, its pulse now calm, steady. The mark on his arm had stopped burning, but the weight of its presence was undeniable. He had made his choice, but it was clear now that it came with consequences. "What have I become?" Aaron whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet. The voice answered once again, this time with finality. "What you have become is only the beginning." Aaron's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the orb in his hand. The eerie glow from its surface bathed the room in an unnatural light, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The silence that followed the explosion of light felt suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened into a heavy, oppressive weight. His mind was reeling. The pain in his arm where the mark had burned earlier was gone, but the sense of dread hadn't lifted. The orb had changed something inside him. He could feel it, a new awareness, a dark force stirring just beneath the surface, waiting for him to call upon it. "What have I done?" Aaron whispered to himself. The words felt empty, as though the truth was slipping through his fingers, too vast and terrible to grasp. He looked around the room. The fog had lifted, but in its place, the walls seemed to close in around him, as if they were shifting to form a maze of unmarked corridors. The once solid floor beneath his feet now appeared uneven, cracked, as though the very foundation of this place was coming undone. The shadows, once gone, began to stir once more. They swirled and coiled, creeping along the walls like living things, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You cannot escape," a voice hissed from the shadows, though it had no identifiable source. Aaron spun around, trying to pinpoint where the voice was coming from, but there was no one there. Just darkness and the ever-growing presence of the orb in his hand. He tried to speak, to cry out, but his throat felt tight, as though the very act of making sound would tear him apart. His fingers tightened involuntarily around the orb, and for a moment he feared it might shatter. But instead of breaking, the orb pulsed with a deep, resonating hum, almost like it was alive, like it was aware of his fear. The shadows around him thickened, and he felt them tugging at him, pulling him towards the center of the room. The walls began to shift again, forming pathways, doors, windows, all of them leading deeper into the unknown. Each one seemed to pulse with the same dark energy that the orb emitted. "I have to get out of here," Aaron muttered, stumbling back toward one of the corridors, but something held him in place. It wasn't the orb. It wasn't the shadows. It was a feeling, a crushing, invisible force that pressed against his chest and kept him rooted to the spot. "Where will you go?" The voice again, louder this time, echoed through the chamber. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was hundreds, thousands, whispers in the dark. I can't stay here, Aaron said, his voice shaky. His gaze flickered from one corridor to the next, each path as uncertain as the last. He needed to make a choice, but how could he choose when every path seemed to lead to doom? The orb in his hand pulsed again, and the shadows seemed to draw back, leaving one passageway open, a single narrow path that led into the abyss. There was no light here, no sign of what lay ahead, only the crushing silence that seemed to stretch forever. The shadows no longer whispered, they screamed. Aaron clenched his fists around the orb, summoning whatever strength he could muster. Go, he shouted at himself, forcing his legs to move. And he did. He ran down the darkened hallway, his feet pounding against the cracked floor as he fled into the unknown. Each step felt like it would be his last, but he pushed forward, propelled by the need to escape, to find something, anything that would offer a shred of hope. The further he ran, the more oppressive the air became. The walls of the corridor seemed to close in around him, the floor beneath his feet buckling and shifting with each step. Every door he passed seemed to lead to nothing, empty rooms, endless voids of blackness. There was no escape. The voice, ever present, followed him, a constant murmur in the back of his mind. You can't outrun it. You can't escape yourself. Aaron stopped, his chest heaving, and looked back. The darkness was closing in on him, faster now, as if it were alive and hunting him. He couldn't keep running. I have to face it, he whispered. The orb in his hand pulsed again, its glow brighter than before. It was as if it was waiting for him to understand, to embrace the power it offered, or to be consumed by it. He stood still for a moment, listening to the growing hum in his chest, the weight of the orb growing heavier in his palm. Then, with a deep breath, he closed his eyes and opened his mind to the power within it. The shadows around him shifted, twisting and coiling like serpents, and a deep, guttural voice boomed in his mind. You are ready? Aaron's eyes snapped open. The darkness was no longer a threat, it was part of him. The mark, the orb, the shadows, they were all connected, and they were waiting for him to wield them. A surge of power shot through his body, and the shadows responded. They twisted and bent to his will, forming into shapes and figures that obeyed his commands. The walls of the corridor crumbled away as the darkness morphed into solid matter. Aaron could feel it now, the raw, untamed power coursing through him. The mark was no longer a burden, was a weapon. I won't be controlled, he said, his voice steady and strong. I will control it. The voice in his mind, the keeper's voice, roared in fury, but Aaron's confidence only grew. He wasn't going to be a puppet. He was the one holding the strings. With a final, commanding thought, Aaron unleashed the full force of the mark. The walls exploded, the shadows disintegrating into nothingness, and the orb flared with a blinding light. When the light faded, Aaron stood alone, the power of the mark pulsing through him. The keeper's voice was gone. The darkness had been banished, for now. But Aaron knew that this was only the beginning. The power inside him would continue to grow, and with it, new challenges would rise. He had no idea what was waiting for him next, but one thing was certain. He was no longer just a man. He was something else now. And he wasn't going to stop until he figured out what that was. Aaron stood in the aftermath of the explosion, his heart still racing from the surge of power that had erupted from within him. The darkness had retreated for now, but the feeling of emptiness that lingered in its wake was almost worse than the shadows themselves. The room around him, once filled with oppressive fog, now lay in eerie silence, the only sound being his own shallow breaths. The orb had vanished. He hadn't seen it disappear, but he could feel it, its energy, its power still thrumming in his veins. The mark on his arm seemed to have changed as well, glowing with a soft, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. He felt different. Stronger, yes, but there was something else, something deeper, darker that he couldn't quite name. His mind was a whirl of confusion. The events of the last few days, hell, the last few hours, felt like a fever dream, each moment blending into the next, until everything became a blur of fear, power, and desperation. And now he was something more. But was it enough? His thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, and deliberate. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. His instincts screamed at him to move, to hide, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey, rooted in place by the overwhelming sense of dread that had crept up on him once again. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, tall and cloaked in darkness. For a moment, Aaron couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person, moving with an unnatural grace. The figure stopped a few feet away from him, its presence somehow colder than the surrounding darkness. "So, you've come this far," the figure said, its voice smooth, almost soothing. Aaron's hand instinctively moved toward the mark on his arm, as if he could summon the power he had felt earlier. But the figure's voice stopped him cold. "Do not bother," it said. "The mark is not yours to command. At least not yet." Aaron's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head slightly, a mocking smile playing on its lips. "You don't know?" The smile faded into something more sinister. "I suppose it doesn't matter now. The time for answers is over." Aaron's pulse quickened. His hand tightened around the invisible grip of the mark, his mind racing. "I won't let you control me," he said, his voice firm. The figure laughed softly, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Control you?" it repeated. "Oh no, Aaron. You were never in control. The mark was always the one pulling the strings." Aaron took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need you. I've already felt its power. I can handle this." "You think you understand the power you've embraced?" the figure said, its voice growing darker. "You don't. You can feel the mark's pull, but you have no idea what it truly is, what it truly means. You have been chosen, Aaron, but you are still far from ready. The orb was just the beginning. The true test is yet to come." The word sent a chill through Aaron's bones. He opened his mouth to respond, but the figure raised a hand, silencing him. "You don't have to believe me," it said, "but there is a price to be paid. There always is." Before Aaron could ask what the figure meant, it stepped forward, the shadows shifting around it as it moved. In an instant, it was standing right in front of him, so close that he could feel its cold presence invading his personal space. "Let me show you what the mark really is," the figure whispered, its breath cold against Aaron's ear. A flash of light engulfed Aaron, and he was no longer in the room with the figure. He was in a vast, desolate landscape, the sky above him swirling with dark clouds that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and dry, as if the very earth had been drained of life. The figure was gone, but Aaron could feel its presence still lingering, watching him from the shadows. He turned around, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was so profound that it felt suffocating. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The ground beneath him shifted, and suddenly shapes began to emerge from the cracks in the earth, twisted, monstrous creatures with eyes that glowed like fire. They crawled toward him, their movements erratic and violent, driven by some unseen force. Aaron instinctively stepped back, but the creatures were fast, their bodies writhing and contorting as they closed in on him. He reached for the mark, trying to summon its power, but this time the orb was gone. The surge of energy that had come so easily before was nowhere to be found. He was alone. The creatures were closing in. But just as they were about to pounce, a voice called out from the shadows. "Is this what you wanted, Aaron?" The voice was the same one that had guided him, taunted him, and threatened him. It echoed around him, reverberating through the air like a clap of thunder. "This is the price of your power. The mark was never meant for someone like you. But now that it's been bound to you, there is no turning back." The creatures lunged, their claws slashing through the air with deadly speed. Aaron barely had time to react as one of them caught him by the arm, its grip tightening like a vice. The pain was excruciating, but he refused to scream. He fought back, thrashing against the creature's hold, but it was no use. There were too many. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the wasteland, watching as the creatures closed in. "I gave you the mark," it said, its voice distant and cold. "I gave you the power. Now you will pay the price." Aaron's vision began to blur, his mind slipping into darkness as the creatures overwhelmed him. The last thing he heard was the figure's voice, fading into the distance. "Remember, Aaron, there is no escaping your fate." Aaron awoke to a strange, disorienting silence. His body felt heavy as though he was submerged underwater, but there was no water, only a vast emptiness. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and his limbs were stiff as though they had been bound for far too long. He tried to move, but it was as if the very air around him had conspired to keep him still. Panic surged through him as he struggled against the invisible force that held him in place. His breathing became shallow, each breath more difficult than the last, until the weight in his chest grew unbearable. His eyes shot open, but the world around him was still nothing but darkness. He could see nothing, hear nothing, feel nothing, except for the deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. But then the silence was broken. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. But it grew louder until it was all-encompassing. It was everywhere, surrounding him, echoing in his mind like 1,000 voices speaking at once. Aaron? The voice was soft but unmistakable. It was the same voice that had taunted him, guided him, threatened him. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from the lack of use. The whispers answered him, but in a language he couldn't understand. The words twisted and morphed in his mind, like broken fragments of a sentence that refused to come together. His head spun as he tried to grasp their meaning, but it was impossible. Then a light appeared. At first it was a distant flicker, nothing more than a faint glow in the endless black. But it grew brighter and soon it was blinding. Aaron winced, squinting his eyes against the sudden intensity, but the light only grew stronger, filling the darkness until there was nowhere else to look but at it. And then it was gone. In its place was a figure. Aaron couldn't make out any details at first, but as his vision cleared, he saw the figure standing before him, shrouded in an aura of pure, white light. Its form was tall and imposing, almost too large for the space it occupied. Its features were hidden in the shadows of its own glow, but there was something unsettling about its presence, something both familiar and alien at the same time. "Who are you?" Aaron's voice was trembling now, and he couldn't stop himself from looking away. He felt small, insignificant in the face of this being. The figure didn't respond right away. It simply stood there, watching him with an unreadable expression. Aaron's heart raced in his chest. "What do you want from me?" The figure moved, but it didn't walk. It glided. It was so smooth, so fluid, that Aaron couldn't tell if it was actually moving or if it was just shifting within the light. It stopped just in front of him, and for the first time Aaron saw its face, or what could have been a face. It was featureless, smooth like a blank canvas, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The air around him seemed to crackle with tension. "Do you remember?" the figure asked, its voice soft and low, echoing around Aaron's mind like a distant murmur. "Remember what?" Aaron's confusion deepened. His head was spinning. He couldn't remember anything, not clearly. The figure raised its hand, and the world around Aaron shifted once more. This time there was no darkness. Instead, he found himself standing in a vast expanse, a landscape that seemed both familiar and foreign. The ground beneath his feet was cracked, dry, and ashen, much like the place he had been before, but this time the sky was different. It wasn't black. It was a sickly green, like the color of old mold or rotting vegetation. And standing before him, like a mirage, was a towering structure. It was a building, but not like any building Aaron had ever seen. It was ancient, its walls cracked and weathered, but there was a strange, unsettling beauty to it. The windows were dark, like empty eyes, staring back at him with silent judgment. "What is this place?" Aaron asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You know what it is," the figure answered, its voice growing louder with each passing second. But Aaron couldn't remember. He couldn't recall anything about this place, why it felt so familiar, why it made his chest tighten with dread. He was trapped in a haze, his mind fogged by the weight of something he couldn't understand. "Look closer," the figure urged, its tone soft but insistent. Aaron took a tentative step forward, his eyes fixed on the building in the distance. He wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to it, compelled to get closer. As he walked, the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, as though the very earth was alive and responding to his presence. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became. Soon he was standing at the entrance to the building. The door was made of dark wood, ancient and worn, but it stood solidly in place as though it had been untouched by time. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling, and pushed it open. The inside was nothing. It was empty, just an endless void stretching out before him like a cavernous abyss. But in the distance he saw a figure. It was small at first, but as it drew closer he realized who it was. It was himself. The figure before him was a younger version of Aaron, his face full of fear and confusion. The figure's eyes locked onto Aaron's, and for a moment they simply stared at one another. "Do you see now?" the figure said, its voice a perfect echo of Aaron's own. "What is this?" Aaron gasped. Who are you? The figure smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down Aaron's spine. I am you, and you are me. The words didn't make sense, and yet, somehow they did. The world around Aaron began to darken, the figure before him fading into the shadows. But as it did, something else emerged from the darkness. Something that was not the figure, not the building, but something more terrifying. It was a presence, something dark, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. And now it was coming for him. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as the dark presence loomed closer. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, thick with a sense of impending doom. His body was frozen, his mind screaming for him to move, to run, but his feet remained glued to the spot. The figure, the other Aaron, had vanished, and now all that was left was the overwhelming, suffocating force of the darkness that surrounded him. It was a presence like no other, something ancient, something that seemed to stretch back to the very beginning of time itself. There were no eyes, no face, just a deep, pervasive feeling that it was watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. He could feel it pressing in on him from all sides, the temperature in the void dropping to freezing levels. It was like being trapped inside a coffin made of shadows, every breath coming harder than the last. The silence was deafening, almost as if the very world had ceased to exist, except for this thing, this entity that was somehow both inescapable and ever-present. Aaron's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. How had he ended up here? What was this place, and why did it feel so wrong? Why did everything about it make his skin crawl, his very soul tremble with fear? Then the voice came again, low and echoing, like the reverberation of 1,000 whispers. You cannot run from what you are, it said, each word wrapping itself around Aaron's mind like a cold, steel chain. You cannot hide from the truth. Aaron swallowed hard. What truth? What do you want from me? The darkness seemed to shift, coiling around him like a living thing. The temperature continued to drop, the cold now biting through his clothes, sinking into his bones. His breath was shallow, the air thick and suffocating, but still the presence didn't move. Instead, it spoke again, its voice drawing closer, creeping into Aaron's ears like the slow drip of water. You think you have control, that the mark makes you powerful. But you are a pawn, nothing more than a tool, and I will use you until your soul is as hollow as the void you found yourself in. Aaron staggered backward, his eyes wide with fear. No, I won't let you. You have no choice, the voice interrupted, its tone now sharp, final. You are bound, Aaron. You are mine. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight as if someone was squeezing the very life from him. He could feel the mark on his arm burning again, its power rising within him, but it wasn't his power. It was theirs. The darkness had control over it, over him. Panic surged through Aaron as the realization hit him. He was trapped. There was no escaping this. No way out. But just as his despair reached its peak, a voice called out from the distance. Aaron? He froze. It was familiar, too familiar. Aaron, listen to me. He whipped around, his eyes scanning the void for any sign of the voice. It was distant, but he could hear it clearly, unmistakably. It was his mother's voice. Mom? He whispered, his voice trembling. Is it really you? The voice echoed back to him, clearer this time. Aaron, you have to wake up. You're losing yourself. Don't let it take you. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Aaron felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. Someone was trying to reach him, trying to pull him back from the brink of whatever nightmare this was. I can't, he choked out, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I'm not strong enough. I don't know how. The voice came again, more urgent now. You don't have to do it alone. The strength is within you. It always has been. Aaron closed his eyes, his mind spinning. Could he trust this voice? Was this truly his mother, or was it just another illusion, another trick of the dark presence that had consumed him? But there was no time to question. He could feel the darkness tightening around him, pressing in from all sides. If he didn't act now, he would be lost forever. He reached out, not knowing if he was reaching for the voice or for something deeper within himself. And then, as if the universe itself had answered, he felt it. A flicker of warmth, a spark of light, deep within him. It was faint, but it was there. The warmth spread, filling his chest with a sudden surge of energy. His body was no longer frozen. He could move. He could breathe. The mark on his arm pulsed with a new, unfamiliar light, no longer a source of fear but of power. His power. The presence, the darkness, recoiled. It faltered for just a moment, and that was enough. Aaron thrust his hand forward, focusing all of his will on the warmth in his chest, on the light that was growing stronger with every passing second. His mind was clear now. He knew what he had to do. The darkness writhed in protest, but Aaron stood firm. The mark on his arm blazed with light, and he called upon it with everything he had. The orb had been his connection to the power, but now he realized it was only a conduit. The true power was within him all along. The light grew brighter, and the shadows around him began to dissipate, unraveling in the face of his newfound strength. The voice, the dark presence, howled in fury as it was driven back, banished by the light that now radiated from within him. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the darkness was gone. Aaron collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The weight on his chest had lifted, the cold retreating into nothingness. He was alive. He had won. But as the void around him faded, a new feeling emerged. Something was still watching him. And in the silence that followed, Aaron realized that the true battle was just beginning. Aaron's breath still came in ragged gasps as he pulled himself to his feet. The air felt lighter now, as though the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on him had finally lifted. But there was a new unease settling deep in his chest. It wasn't the crushing fear he had felt moments before. No, this was something different, something that gnawed at him from the inside, making every nerve in his body tingle with a warning that something was far from over. He looked around. The world, or what was left of it, had changed once again. The jagged, lifeless landscape had shifted back into something more familiar, his childhood home. He was standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the warmth of a place he once felt safe. The familiar smell of his mother's cooking lingered in the air, and the soft hum of a clock ticking filled the silence. It was home, but something was wrong. The walls were too still, the air too thick, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His pulse quickened. "Aaron?" The voice came from behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, just as it should be. Yet the voice had been so clear, so real. "Aaron, don't you remember?" It came again, louder this time, closer. His heart hammered in his chest. There was something about it, something about the way it sounded that made his skin crawl. It wasn't his mother's voice anymore. It wasn't even the voice of the darkness. It was something else, something darker. His head spun, and he staggered forward, his hands gripping the edge of a table to steady himself. He had to get out of here. He had to leave before whatever this was could reach him. But his feet wouldn't move. "Don't run from me, Aaron. You can't escape your destiny." Aaron's stomach churned. He knew that voice. He had heard it before, but he couldn't place it, not yet. It was like a nightmare that lingered in the back of his mind, always just out of reach, teasing him with fragments of forgotten memories. He turned to face the voice, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the growing sense of dread. But when he looked into the empty space in front of him, he saw something he wasn't expecting. A figure. It was a man, tall, thin, wearing a dark coat, with sharp features and eyes that gleamed like two glowing embers. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, but Aaron couldn't quite place why. The man stood perfectly still, his presence commanding the room, filling it with a chill that cut through Aaron's already fragile nerves. "Aaron," the man's voice was smooth, almost coaxing. "You've been running for far too long. Don't you want to know what really happened?" "No," Aaron replied quickly, his voice hoarse. "I don't want to know. Please just leave me alone." But the man didn't move. Instead, his eyes fixed on Aaron with an intensity that made him feel as though he were being weighed, measured. Like he was nothing more than a specimen under the scrutiny of some higher power. "You can't run from this," the man repeated, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Not anymore. It's time you learn the truth. You've forgotten it, but I haven't. You'll remember soon enough, Aaron. And when you do, you'll understand everything." Aaron shook his head, his mind spinning. The figure's words were like a cold slap to the face, and they hit him with such force that he couldn't shake the feeling that they were real, that they were speaking to something deep within him, something he had long buried. I don't know you," Aaron whispered, but his voice faltered. It was a lie, and he knew it. The figure smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made Aaron's stomach twist in knots. "Oh, but you do. You just don't remember. Not yet." The man took a step forward, and Aaron instinctively took a step back, his pulse quickening. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but his feet were frozen. It was like some invisible force was holding him in place, trapping him in this strange, suffocating reality. You've seen things, Aaron. Things you didn't want to see, and you've been running from them. But the truth is always closer than you think. The figure's eyes glinted with something that looked like satisfaction. And now it's time for you to face what you've done. Done? Aaron repeated, his voice cracking. What do you mean, what I've done? The figure's smile deepened, and for a moment, Aaron saw a flicker of something dark and terrifying behind his eyes. You know what you've done, Aaron. You just need to remember. It's all connected. The mark, the visions, the darkness. You created it? No? Aaron shouted, shaking his head. No, I didn't. I didn't do any of this. The figure's smile widened. You think you're innocent? That you've been a victim of all this? It's much worse than that, Aaron. You've been a part of it all along. You were always meant to be here. Aaron's mind reeled. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had been running from something, he had known that much. But to think he was somehow responsible for all of this, for everything that had happened, felt like a blow to the gut. It didn't make sense. But as the man's words sank deeper into his mind, something shifted in Aaron. Something stirred beneath the surface, something buried for far too long. He could feel it now. Something dark, something hidden in the recesses of his memory, something he had never wanted to face. But he had to. He had no choice. He took a deep breath and looked the man in the eye. Tell me, Aaron said, his voice steady despite the fear that clenched at his heart. What is it I need to remember? The man's smile was the last thing Aaron saw before everything went dark. The darkness enveloped Aaron like a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold. His eyes snapped open, but all he saw was black. No shape, no sound. Only the thick, stifling quiet that seemed to press in from all directions. He could feel the weight of it, the oppressive absence of light, the sensation that he was sinking deeper and deeper into some unfathomable void. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. It was as if the darkness had wrapped itself around him, tying him in place, and the air, if there even was any, was too thick to inhale. What had happened? Where was he? His mind raced, every thought jumbled, unsure. The last thing he remembered was the figure, the man who had claimed that Aaron had created this nightmare. The man who had said Aaron was responsible for the darkness, for everything. Aaron tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His chest felt tight, and every attempt to move or break free from the invisible grip of the void only made him feel more trapped. And then, as if in answer to his desperation, a voice broke the silence. Aaron? It was soft, faint, familiar. Mom? He gasped, but his voice was no more than a whisper lost in the endless black. Aaron, you have to listen to me. You have to fight this. The voice, distant but clear, was filled with an urgency that made Aaron's heart pound in his chest. He didn't know how or why, but he could feel her. He could feel his mother's presence, like a light in the midst of all the darkness, guiding him, calling him. You're not alone, Aaron. You never have been. Her words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep inside him. A flicker of hope, a spark of realization that he hadn't fully understood before. The darkness couldn't keep him forever. It couldn't control him. But he had to fight. He had to remember who he was. I'm here, Aaron whispered, though it felt as though his words were lost in the void. I'm not giving up. The moment the words left his lips, the darkness seemed to shift. It felt as though the very air around him had been disturbed, as if something was starting to change. A low hum vibrated through the stillness, growing louder with every passing second. He focused, drawing from the faint sense of warmth and light that his mother's voice had reignited within him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Aaron? The voice was stronger now, clearer. It wasn't just his mother's voice, it was the voice of everyone he had lost, of everyone who had been a part of his past. Their combined presence filled the void with a sense of urgency and support. Fight it, Aaron. Remember who you are. And then, with a sudden clarity that shocked him, the memories began to rush back. The faces, the voices, the places that had seemed so far away, they all came rushing back like a flood. His family, his childhood, everything that had shaped him, everything he had been running from, all of it flooded his mind in a wave of emotion. But with the memories came something else, a darker, more terrifying truth. The man. The figure. The one who had told him he was responsible. Aaron knew now that he wasn't just fighting a physical battle. This was about more than escaping the darkness or surviving the nightmarish world he found himself in. It was about accepting something that he had never wanted to face. He had created this darkness. He had let it grow within him, feeding it with his fear, his anger, his doubts. It wasn't just the mark or the visions. It was everything he had repressed, every secret, every mistake, every moment of weakness. The darkness wasn't something outside of him. It was him. And it was time to stop running. Suddenly, the blackness around him began to shift. He felt the weight on his chest lessen, and the oppressive pressure that had suffocated him began to lift. The air felt less dense, the silence less suffocating. The void began to dissipate, the darkness breaking apart like shattered glass. And in its place, a new light began to shine, warm, golden, steady. Aaron's heart raced, and he realized that the light was not just around him. It was inside of him, burning brighter than he had ever known. He was in control. The mark on his arm began to glow, no longer a symbol of fear, but of strength. The power that had once terrified him was now his to command, and the realization hit him with a force that almost knocked him to his knees. He wasn't just a victim of whatever dark forces had plagued him. He had been the one to create them, but he could also destroy them. With every breath, he drew more of the light into himself, pushing back the shadows that threatened to consume him. The figure, the man who had claimed to be his creator, was gone, his voice no longer an echo in the void. Aaron stood tall, his body brimming with a newfound power, a power that was his to wield. And as the darkness around him disappeared completely, he understood one final, undeniable truth. The darkness wasn't his enemy. It was his own reflection. He had been running from himself. But now he was ready to face who he truly was. And with that, the world around him began to change. The empty void that had once consumed him was replaced by the familiar warmth of his childhood home. The air felt lighter, and the light that filled the room was not oppressive but comforting. Aaron stepped forward, no longer the fearful, lost soul who had wandered through the nightmare. He was someone different now, someone stronger, someone who had faced the darkest parts of himself and emerged victorious. As he walked out of the room, the door closed softly behind him, leaving the darkness behind for good. And for the first time in a long time, Aaron smiled. The journey had been long. The battles had been fierce. But it was over, and he had won.